In April 2011 in Glasgow, Scotland, a 27-year-old woman named Linda Spence went missing. Linda masqueraded as a financial advisor and partook in many shady deals. Linda put up this facade of running 2 successful businesses, including a mortgage broking company and a rental property establishment, when in reality she was not only in debt to traditional loaners but also sketchier groups as well. Linda's businesses were bankrupt, and thus she was resorting to illegal and fraudulent activities to try and claw her way out of this hole she was in. It was said that Linda's boyfriend even did business in illegal areas, and that's how she met 2 criminals named Colin Coates and Philip Wade, 2 men who would change Linda's life for the worse. Colin Coates in particular is a very interesting / weird individual. His friends and family all described him as a sort of geek. Colin was able to find a successful career in investment banking and built up a significant amount of wealth. He would go on to marry and have 3 kids, but in the late 90s, he was arrested for hitting his wife. At some point, he and his family moved from London to Glasgow, where Colin sought a new route for his life. Instead of investment banking, Colin now pursued property development, where he also found immense success. But it was around this time where Colin found himself using various illegal substances and drinking in excessive amounts. These new vices caused Colin to become more and more violent and aggressive towards everyone in his life, leading to his divorce. And due to all of the success he had in life, he became extremely egotistical. Colin's personality and life spun wildly out of control, and eventually he came into contact with the other man we mentioned, Philip Wade. And it's through Philip that Colin met Linda. Linda told Colin about her situation and her businesses. After some coercing, Linda was able to convince Colin to loan her some money. At first, the amounts were relatively small, not exceeding more than the mid-4 figures. But quickly, the total amount owed back to Colin was nearing 6 figures. Linda obviously did not have the funds to pay back Colin, so instead, she provided him with an exclusive investment opportunity. Linda was sort of selling this like, hey, I wasn't going to let you in at first because it's so profitable, but because I owe you, I'll give you a shot. The project was an airport property that for all intents and purposes looked pretty promising. Colin hopped on it, believing that he would make back the money Linda owed him many times over. However, after he put in more money, Colin came to the realization that this was all a scam that Linda was using to keep him from freaking out over the money he had already lost. It was March 2011 when Colin finally understood that he was being played. And again, I want to make it perfectly clear and remind you guys that Colin was extremely arrogant at this point and wildly egotistical. Pair that kind of personality with some alcohol and you just get a really fragile and pissed off man. Colin's ego just couldn't handle the fact that he had been scammed, so he confided in his friend Philip Wade, who had also been scammed by Linda in the past. They came up with a plan to kidnap Linda and force her to pay what she owed. The two carried out this plan in April of the same year and bound her to a chair in an abandoned building. Linda was subjected to 2 weeks of extreme punishment. Unfortunately, I cannot actually describe what they actually did, but it was very bad and only got worse as the days went on. Linda was never allowed to rise from her chair, so she was even sitting in her own waste. Furthermore, she lost a number of fingers as a result of the incident. In the meantime, Colin and Philip were using Linda's phone to message her friends and family so that they would not suspect anything. Fast forward to late April, Colin came into contact with one of Linda's other clients who had loaned her nearly £200,000. This other client was named John, and according to him, Linda had paid back about £50,000. But Colin was not buying it and claimed he had received much more than $50,000. Colin screamed at John, saying that the money he received was actually his. He revealed hints at what he was doing to Linda and threatened to do the same to John if he wouldn't give up the money he received from Linda. Ultimately, when Philip and Colin believed that they weren't going to get much more progress out of the situation, they ended Linda's life. After disposing of her body, the two no longer kept in contact with Linda's family, so they grew worried and reported her missing in May of 2011. Now, it turns out that Linda was actually a police informant, so when authorities realized that she was missing, they promptly set out to find out what happened, and that's when they stumbled upon the name Colin Coates. So back to that other guy named John who Linda was also paying back. He actually went to police after that meeting he had with Colin. With this new information, investigators were eventually able to locate the building where Linda was being held. Inside, they realized that Colin and Philip had attempted to scrape the entire area clean of any DNA, but they failed. Investigators were able to find a minute trace of Linda's blood in the room. Furthermore, during the time that Linda was being held there, Colin got the help of two small-time criminals to watch over Linda when Colin and Philip couldn't. Police were able to identify these other two criminals, and they immediately spilled the beans about Colin when they were arrested. But Colin and Philip denied any involvement in Linda's disappearance and murder. It was during the investigation into Colin when investigators came upon this rather unsettling video footage.
Saying I'll do the wetsuit and the Sean Connery. I have the booster in my side, too much money, right? I went up to drop off some inspiration, right? And as I went to drop off the inspiration, she handed me something back. So I went and left for a few hours with my mate Mark, got absolutely tarted. Turned up at the door later on. She who must not be named was there, right? That's when I turned up. And I turned up just in a pen of stockings. Young men for extortion, abduction, tying up, monitoring funerals for mitzvahs. Call 1-800-SUPER-PANY. See you, bye!
Ultimately, the two men were found guilty. Colin received a life sentence with a minimum term of 33 years, while Philip got life with a minimum of 31 years. At the time, police couldn't locate Linda's body, and neither culprit was willing to share any info either. Fast forward to 2023, Colin finally admitted to killing Linda and sent a letter to her mother which said, "I feel compelled to clarify some background for Patricia Spence, with her plight of finding her daughter's remains. Linda's parents' animus towards me is expected. I tortured and killed her daughter." In that letter, he also revealed the location of Linda's remains. However, it seems as though authorities couldn't find anything when they searched the area. You know, being a true crime YouTuber sometimes takes you to some weird corners of the internet, and for those Reddit videos that I do, those definitely take me to some weird places. If you recall, I had to search up an image where a man blasted his load continuously for months into a pair of boxers without cleaning them. Why am I telling you all this? Well, it's because I don't really want to let other people see what I search for on the internet. That's where today's sponsor, NordVPN, comes in. When I know I'm going to be diving into some gnarly researching session, I just switch it on. But my favorite part about Nord is that they're able to protect me from various cybersecurity threats. In order to bring you guys all these videos, I'm pretty much online all the time, which is going to expose me to a lot of potentially harmful links and websites. But with NordVPN's threat protection, I can pretty much just surf the web at my own leisure, knowing that they will notify me of any harmful links, files, or shady websites. And being a YouTube creator, one of your worst nightmares is waking up to your channel being hacked one day. With the dark web monitor that NordVPN provides, I am notified whenever any of my credentials appear where they shouldn't be. Nord's password manager allows for the generation of brand new, stronger passwords. Use this to protect your private information in your everyday life. Check out the link below for an exclusive deal. On a 2-year plan, you'll get an additional 4 months extra for no added charge. And with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, it's completely risk-free, so give them a try today. Thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring today's video. Dolly Flesh is a very strange YouTuber and person, to say the least. His original channel has been deleted, but there is another that archives some of his videos. Dolly Flesh did create a second channel where he mainly focused on Let's Plays, which is still up. But the channel has been abandoned as the most recent upload was made 3 years ago. And just to give you a taste of this guy, watch this clip.
In my other video, I claimed I was looking forward to losing my to a forward hot girl. I meant to say a forward silicone I'm the type of guy that never wants to have kids. But if you decide to have babies with, well, you don't have to worry about it starving or being killed. How often will you find a girlfriend that's custom designed and perfect the way you look, or even one without arms and legs? Maybe you'll get tired of screwing her in her plastic bum and want to move to her ear canals, which are stretchier than real human ear canals. If you don't have a poo fetish, then you won't have to worry about her pooing or farting all the time.
I'm not even gonna lie, I was sort of dying of laughter when I first watched that video. Some people thought that this guy was just making a satire account at first, but later videos would suggest otherwise. Dolly Fletch's real name is Leighton Allen LaBoot. His main channel videos primarily consisted of stop-motion clay animations, which contained some level of disturbed moments as well. Additionally, he often touched on morbid topics including murder, assault, animal abuse, and more. One of the characters that frequently appeared in his videos was named Itchy the Clown, who is based off of John Wayne Gacy. Now, let's take a look at a Twitter post he made on May 6th, 2019, where he mentioned that he wanted to purchase some hamsters. About a week later, he uploaded a video to his YouTube channel where he showed off the hamsters that he ended up buying. The very next day, he uploaded a video torturing and killing them. It seems that the videos are more or less lost media now, which is probably a good thing. And on screen, you can get an idea of just what the video showed. The guy was really in the head, which gets you thinking about all of those graphic and gory claymation videos he made. Was he using YouTube as a way to vent? And if he was led to his own vices for long enough, would he have escalated from animals to humans? On May 25th, 2020, Dolly Fletch was arrested for the murder and abuse of those hamsters, but he was released after covering a $1,000 bail. His trial didn't take place until August 16th, 2021, and during his questioning, when he was asked why he did it, Dolly simply said he was bored and found it entertaining. His main YouTube channel peaked out at about 2.4k subscribers before being terminated by YouTube on January 14th, 2020. Anatoly Moskvin is a Russian former linguist, philologist, and historian who had taken an interest in cemeteries and the macabre from a young age. For instance, he often stopped by cemeteries at night with his friends as a child. An odd hobby to say the least, regardless of your age. This interest quickly evolved into a fascination with dead bodies. This would also lead to Anatoly developing an interest in dolls. Later in life, Anatoly found happiness in collecting dolls after realizing that they have a similar lifeless feel to them. The act of collecting dolls itself is obviously harmless, but simply collecting them was not enough for Anatoly. Eventually, he made the decision to stop by a cemetery and dig up a body, where he then turned the body into a doll. When Anatoly's strange and honestly disgusting interest received attention, an article was written about him. It also contained several statements made by Anatoly himself. In this article, he stated his enjoyment towards the dead began when he saw the funeral ceremony for an 11-year-old girl. At the funeral, he was forced to kiss the girl's face as a sign of respect. After graduating from Moscow State University, Anatoly amassed a massive collection of over 60,000 books and documents going over burial rituals, the occult, and anything related to death. Anatoly led a lonely life, never marrying. It's believed that he never even went on a date with anyone before. It was only on November 2nd, 2011 when Anatoly was arrested after police were tipped off about some vandalized graves. Someone stated that they saw someone who appeared similar to Anatoly desecrating the headstones of various graves in a number of cemeteries. When police investigated Anatoly's living space, they found 26 bodies/dolls, but it should be stated that Anatoly was reported to have destroyed the graves of over 150 people. When investigators entered Anatoly's residence, they discovered the human dolls placed in positions of daily life, like sitting on the couch, for example. The crazy part was, Anatoly lived with his parents who claimed to have had no knowledge of what he was doing. Or rather, they knew about his doll hobby, but they didn't know that these dolls were of corpses. It's also believed that Anatoly would sleep with the dolls, which were often of little girls. In a journal, Anatoly wrote, "I kissed her once, then again, then again." Another interesting point is that investigators actually did not realize the bodies were mummified corpses until Anatoly said so. They truly just look like like dolls at first. It was later determined by medical professionals that Anatoly had a form of paranoid schizophrenia and he was deemed unfit to stand trial. He was ultimately transferred to a psychiatric clinic. Anatoly later informed an interviewer that he simply wanted to revive the deceased children with science and black magic since he felt bad for them. He even refused to apologize to the parents of the children whose graves he desecrated since he believed he was helping. Anatoly escalated these exchanges by accusing these parents of abuse for leaving their kids out in the cold via their graves when he brought them into his own home. On November 22, 2003, 22-year-old Drew Sjodin was working her shift at the Victoria's Secret store at Columbia Mall in Grand Forks, North Dakota. It was around 4 p.m. when Drew finished her shift and decided to shop around the mall for a new item, specifically a purse, and it would be in the store where she made the purchase when we get the final moments Drew was seen alive. After completing her purchase and exiting the mall, Drew went to the parking lot and made her way towards her 1994 Oldsmobile Cutlass. At the same time, Drew was also talking with her boyfriend on the phone. The two were less than 5 minutes into their conversation when Drew's boyfriend Chris heard Drew saying, "Okay. The call disconnected, and initially, Chris didn't think anything of this. He simply thought that he had lost signal. Over 3 hours later, around 7:30 p.m., Chris received a phone call. Upon picking it up, he realized the call was being made from Drew's phone, but after answering, no one spoke on the other end. Eventually, Chris just hung up. Again, he didn't think anything sinister was happening at that moment, but at this point, he was a little bit concerned. It wasn't until the next day when Drew failed to show up for work when police were contacted. Law enforcement realized that Drew was last seen in the mall, so they suspected that perhaps she may be trapped somewhere within the building. They looked over the footage of Drew making her purchase and traced her steps into the parking lot. To their surprise, they found Drew's vehicle still there. Suspicions grew as law enforcement now suspected foul play. After Chris informed them about the phone call he had with Drew, they believed that Drew was threatened by someone with a weapon when she approached her vehicle. From there, she was forced into another car and taken away. Then, a little over a week later, police paid a visit to one of their suspects who had a criminal history. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., the 50-year-old man who lived with his mother, was a registered sex offender. Alfonso had recently completed a 20-plus year sentence. If you recall, I shared that there was an additional phone call made the same day that Drew disappeared. Police were able to track that call down to an area near Fisher High School in Fisher, Minnesota. Alfonso lived not far from this location, and the fact that this guy was around minors at a high school in the first place after getting out of prison is also very concerning. During his questioning, Alfonso did state that he was at the Columbia Mall on November 22nd. However, he said he was in the theater watching a movie called Once Upon a Time in Mexico. This is where his story falls apart, as the theater was not showing this movie at the time. If the fact that Alfonso was highly likely to reoffend and was in the same location as Drew on the day she disappeared wasn't enough, police found a receipt for a knife that Alfonso recently purchased as well. The weapon listed on the receipt was later found in Alfonso's possession, resting in a container of cleaning solution. The discovery of the knife also led to Drew's blood on another knife being discovered in Alfonso's vehicle. Fast forward to April 17, 2004, Drew's body was finally discovered. It was located in Crookston, Minnesota, which was the same city where Alfonso lived with his mother. It was only discovered after large piles of snow had finally melted. Drew's body was partially clothed, with her hands tied behind her back. Near her body was also a shopping bag, suggesting that she may have died of suffocation. There were clear signs that she had been. She also had knife wounds around her body. Medical examiners weren't 100% sure how Drew died, but they stated that it could have been one of the three, either a major neck wound, suffocation, or exposure to the elements. Something interesting to note about this case is that the abduction took place in North Dakota, but Alfonso crossed state lines into Minnesota to commit the actual murder. Why is this relevant? Well, this turns the case into a federal matter. Still, you might wonder what difference that makes. So North Dakota and Minnesota both lack a death penalty, but being that this is now a federal crime, the death penalty is now on the table. On August 30th, 2006, Alfonso was convicted of kidnapping and taking the life of Drew Sjodin. On February 8th, 2007, he was sentenced to death. However, Alfonso would never actually die. In October of 2011, Alfonso's attorneys filed a new motion that claimed he was mentally disabled. Then in 2021, the same judge that sentenced Alfonso to death overturned his sentence. Then 2 years after that, in March, prosecutors made the announcement that they were going to drop the death penalty that they were previously seeking for Alfonso, and instead he was sentenced to life without parole on May 18th, 2023. Robert Ben Rhoades, aka the truck stop killer, has been convicted for several rape and murder charges in the 80s and 90s, but he is believed to have had over 50 female victims in total. His most notorious crime involved a 14-year-old named Regina Walters and her 18-year-old boyfriend, Ricky Jones. Regina had run away from home in February of 1990, and around that same time, Robert Rhoades had stumbled upon the couple on the side of the road. Robert was a truck driver at the time and saw that the two were hitchhiking. Noticing that both were on the younger side, he saw this as a prime opportunity to claim 2 more lives. Regina's mother later revealed to law enforcement that her daughter ran away as a result of an argument that the two had. She was remorseful and says she wanted Regina to come home after reporting her as missing. Now, Regina actually ran away from home a number of times in the past, but each time she would eventually return before anyone got worried. But anyway, back to Robert and his encounter with the couple. Robert agreed to driving Ricky and Regina to their destination, and by this time, Robert was believed to have already had experience with abducting and murdering people. Right after the two climbed inside of the truck and shut the doors, hit the fan. Robert drew a gun and shot Ricky to death before dumping his body on the side of the road. As for Regina, she was kept alive so that Robert could use her to satisfy some degenerate desires he had. The year prior, Robert had actually done more or less the exact same thing to another couple. Those victims' names were Douglas Sikowski and Patricia Walsh. Robert later learned about the missing persons report that was issued for Regina. So what this man would do was call Regina's father and taunt the man. He described the things that he was doing to Regina, and he found a new form of pleasure from making Regina's family miserable. So he kept Regina alive longer than his past victims. Robert also pretty much cut off all of Regina's hair and took this photo of her in a black dress. This photo has gone on to become one of the most well-known and eerie true crime images over the years. It also marks the final moments of Regina's life as Robert strangled her to death shortly after taking it. Regina's remains were left to decompose at that exact location. There are a number of other photos that accompany this one, and in some you can see bruises and such along Regina's body. Her remains were not found until late September of 1990 in that abandoned barn located near Greenville, Illinois. Medical officials believe that Regina was killed around March of 1990. As for Ricky's remains, they were found in May of that same year. Robert Rhoades was arrested on April 1st, 1990 near Casa Grande, Arizona. A highway patrol trooper came across Robert's truck with its hazard lights on and stopped to investigate. When the trooper took a look inside of the vehicle, he noticed a nude woman screaming for her life. She was also handcuffed. There was no way for Robert to explain his way out of this situation. He was arrested and charged with aggravated assault, assault, and unlawful imprisonment. But before he was brought in, he almost escaped from the trooper's vehicle. After digging into Robert's history some more, investigators picked up on a pattern and decided to look through his residence. That's where they found evidence of Robert being a serial killer. Robert was convicted in 1994 and was sentenced to life without parole at Menard Correctional Center. But in 2005, he was extradited to Utah, then to Texas, where he pleaded guilty in order to avoid the death penalty. This entry takes us back to February of 1999, where a group of 3 decided to take a trip to Yosemite National Park. They were 42-year-old Carol Sund, her daughter 16-year-old Jolee, and Jolie's friend Silvina Peloso, who is a 16-year-old exchange student from Argentina. Carol and Jolee wanted to make the most of the brief amount of time Silvina had to stay in the US, so the two discussed potential things to do and places to visit, not entirely sure which they should pick. In the end, they agreed that visiting the Yosemite National Park would be an amazing experience for everyone. But before they stopped by Yosemite, they first visited a number of other locations throughout California so Silvina could take in the sights. When they completed their list of other places to visit, the trio stopped by a motel located right outside the national park. The motel is known as Cedar Lodge. When the group was settled, they spent that day and the next exploring the park, taking pictures, and just enjoying each other's company. When it was getting late and dark on February 15th, the group decided to head back to their motel room and get some rest before heading back to the airport the next morning to return home. To add to the colorful collection of photos they had taken, Jolee wanted to get a picture of her mom and Sylvina. What you see on screen is that picture Jolee took. Shortly after taking it, tragedy would strike. About 2 years before Carol, Jolee, and Sylvina made this trip to the Yosemite National Park, a man named Cary Stayner applied for a position at the Cedar Lodge Motel, and he got hired as a handyman. Now, what exactly is Cary's relevance to this story, you may ask? Well, he kills Carol, Jolee, and Sylvina shortly after Jolee had taken that picture I showed you earlier. Or rather, he killed Carol and Sylvina, then ran off with Jolee as he had much darker plans for her. Cary had walked up to the room the three were staying in and knocked on the door, stating that there were several issues with the bathroom. Obviously, it's not really people's first thought that they are at the threat of a killer, so Carol allowed Cary in. He said thanks and that he would be out in just a moment. He walks over to the bathroom with his tools and emerges shortly after. However, he had a firearm pointed at the group. Cary threatened them all, ordering them to stay silent. He told them that he was simply after their money and valuables, and as soon as he got them, he'd be on his way and their lives would be spared. Everyone complies, and Cary motions for them to move over as he grabs his duct tape to tie them all up. Once everyone was immobilized, he then took the lives of Carol and Sylvina, but left Jolee alive. He had no intentions on keeping anyone alive for very long, and he couldn't care less about that money. Instead, he had a carnal desire that he wanted to satiate. One after the other, Cary tossed Carol and Sylvina into the trunk of the rental car Carol had been driving. Then he tossed Jolee into the front of the car where he could keep an eye on her. Not like she was in any position to struggle anyway. Fast forward the next day, February 16th, Carol and the girls were supposed to check out of the motel and start their drive to the airport, but they never checked out. And back home, Carol's husband, Jens, was waiting to pick up the group from the airport. They never showed up. He tried calling Carol several times, but every single attempt failed. Jens then suspected something bad had happened, but at first he thought that maybe they had simply gotten lost. So he called authorities and informed them that his wife, daughter, and one of her daughter's friends had likely gotten lost in the woods of Yosemite National Park. This information was relayed down to a station closer to the park, and a search party was sent out to investigate and hopefully find the group. Investigators interviewed people at the motel and other hikers, asking if anyone had seen Carol or the girls. And while there were a number of people who did see them, no one really had any valuable information in terms of where they could be. So the search parties continued to comb the wilderness, and they eventually made a discovery. Someone had found Carol's wallet. However, it was found in a completely different location. The wallet was found in Modesto, which was west of the park by about 90 to 100 miles, depending on which route you took. At this point, some suspected that maybe the group wasn't simply lost in the forest. Maybe they had been abducted or worse, killed, and the person had passed through Modesto. The search continued, and hope of even finding the three was starting to fade. But then on March 18th, another discovery was made. Carol's rental car was found. But there was an issue, a major issue. The car had been completely burned. The car was found in Stanislaus National Forest, which was north of the motel where Carol, Jolee, and Sylvina were staying at. This obviously confused investigators even more. Carol's wallet was found towards the west, while her car was found north and in the middle of the forest. It was becoming more and more clear that this was the act of someone with cruel intentions. A group of searchers set out from the location of the vehicle in search of Carol, but right as they were leaving, another person discovers the charred remains of not only Carol, but Sylvina as well. Both of them had been found inside the trunk of the car. At this point, it was obvious that foul play was involved, but the search was not yet over. Jolee was still missing, and authorities held out hope that she was still out there and alive. The story about these remains found in that charred vehicle quickly spread, which led to an interesting letter. Police had received a handwritten note with a crudely drawn map and the phrase, "We had fun with this one," scrawled at the top, and you could probably take an accurate wild guess at who wrote and sent it. Authorities visited the location that was shared on the note, and when they got there, they indeed found the remains of Jolee Sund with the use of a search dog. Medical officials shared that she had been and died as a result of a neck wound caused by a knife. They had also shared that while Carol had been strangled to death, Sylvina had been shot, and just like Jolee, Sylvina had also been prior to her death. Authorities retraced their steps and went back to the Cedar Lodge motel to thoroughly interview all of the staff, asking if they had seen anything or anyone that was suspicious. And amongst those that were interviewed was Cary Stayner himself. Police shared that at no point did anyone suspect him of being the culprit. He came across as a totally normal man. They revisited Modesto since Carol's wallet was found there, however, this was simply a red herring placed by Cary. I'm not sure about now, but at the time, Modesto was known for its criminal population. Almost everywhere you went in Modesto, there were offenders and illegal substance dealers. Cary knew this and thought that if he placed a wallet there, police would be more likely to assume that the killer was also in that location. As leads dried up, investigators thought to themselves, is it possible that the culprit was actually already behind bars for a different crime? And they were actually convinced of this and gave up on the search, believing the killer was already apprehended. But fast forward to July, they would be in for a rude awakening. The headless remains of a young woman named Joey Armstrong were found in the Yosemite National Park. This discovery pulled investigators back into reality. Carol, Jolee, and Sylvina's killer was still out there. Just a day earlier, July 21st, Joey's friends had reported her missing after she failed to meet them for a hiking trip. Joey's body was found less than a mile from her cabin in the park. Investigators had stumbled upon it near a small stream after they were informed of Joey's disappearance by her friends. What had happened here is that Cary was wandering the woods and accidentally encountered Joey's cabin. Realizing that she was living all alone, he saw a perfect opportunity to strike. You see, Cary actually frequently went out and wandered the wilderness and indulged in a variety of substances. He had ambushed Joey and threatened her with a firearm before tying her up. Based on the area around where Joey was found, investigators believed that there was an intense struggle, so they proposed the possibility that Joey had actually escaped from Cary after she was tied up in his truck. But she didn't get far before Cary caught up and took her life. According to some anonymous hikers, Cary's truck had been seen in the area of Joey's cabin, so police went over to the Cedar Lodge in order to talk to Cary. However, he wasn't there. Strange, as he was said to never be late or miss a day at work. Just days later, police received a tip on Cary's whereabouts. Two police officers headed over to a nudist resort called Laguna del Sol, which was located northwest of the park, and it's there where police easily found and apprehended Cary. When officials went up to the front desk and showed a picture of Cary, they easily pointed him out in a tent, saying he's the only guy here with clothes on. In his possession, authorities found what they called a murder kit, basically just a combination of supplies that a killer would need. And now I'd like to take a look into Cary's past, as it is very interesting. And trust me, you'll want to stick around and listen to the entire thing. Cary Stayner had a brother named Stephen. Stephen had actually been kidnapped by a man named Kenneth Parnell in December of 1972 in Merced, California. Kenneth had recruited a man named Irvin Murphy to help him find and capture new targets. One target he had been eyeing was Stephen. So after studying Stephen's daily routine, he set in motion a plan after Stephen left school. Irvin waited for him and handed him a religious flyer, claiming to be a representative of the local church. Stephen said that he was just a kid that didn't really have anything to donate to the church, but obviously Irvin didn't care about that and asked if his family could donate instead. Stephen said yeah, his mom probably could. Irvin said that was great and asked the boy where he lived. After sharing his address, Irvin invited him into a white Buick driven by Kenneth, and the two headed over to Stephen's house. Not really. Instead, Stephen was taken to a secret cabin of Kenneth's. The whole drive, Stephen was confused and frequently told Irvin that they were not going in the right direction. At some point, Kenneth told Stephen that his parents could no longer afford him, so they gave him custody of Stephen. And days after being abducted, Kenneth started to rape the boy. He gave him a new name as well, Dennis Parnell. And Kenneth, who now pretended to be his father, actually went out of his way to enroll him in schools over the following years. Kenneth also allowed his friends and acquaintances to take advantage of Stephen. As Stephen got older and his body began to mature, Kenneth was no longer attracted to him, and thus he began scouting for a new victim. Similar to Irvin all those years ago, Kenneth now had Stephen fulfill the role of luring people to him. On February 14th, 1980, Kenneth and Stephen had set in motion a plan to kidnap a 5-year-old boy in Utah. However, Stephen actually returned the child to his parents instead of following through with Kenneth's plan. On March 1st, when Kenneth had a night shift, Stephen took the 5-year-old and left. The two went to a police station, and the very next day, authorities arrested Kenneth. Stephen and the other boy were finally returned to their loving families, and for Stephen, it was about 7 years where he had been locked away and abused. I've spent a lot of time on Cary's brother by now, so I don't want to drag this out too much longer, but long story short, Kenneth only received a 7-year prison sentence before later being convicted for other crimes in the mid-2000s, landing him a 25 to life sentence. He ended up dying in 2008. So now with all of that out of the way, what is the significance of Stephen in Cary's life? Well, Cary was scarred by Stephen's kidnapping. Prior to Stephen's disappearance, Cary was a normal person with a good temperament, but after Stephen was kidnapped, you'll see that in a lot of photos of Cary during that period, he is actually wearing a hat. This was because he had uncontrollable urges to rip out his hair in frustration and despair over his brother, and in order to cope with these feelings, he did some strange and things. He was also said to lash out violently at times for reasons that were seemingly meaningless. Fast forward to when Stephen returned to his family, everyone, including Cary, were ecstatic. However, Cary quickly grew to resent Stephen. Understandably, after getting one of their kids back, the Stayner parents gave Stephen a lot more attention. Cary felt as though he was being completely ignored. Additionally, Stephen was viewed as a hero by the public for saving that 5-year-old. There were even documentary-type movies and books that were made on Stephen for this courageous act. Cary grew envious and wanted his own movie. In later interviews, Cary said that one of the major reasons he even committed these acts of violence in the first place was in hopes that someone would create a movie about him, similar to Stephen. In September of 1989, Stephen Stayner actually died as a result of a motorcycle accident, specifically a hit-and-run event. The person responsible was later found, but they only received a 3-month prison sentence. And amongst those that appeared at Stephen's funeral was that little boy he saved who was a teen at this point. So anyway, to some, Stephen's kidnapping is viewed as sort of the event that started Cary's downward spiral. After being arrested, Cary told police that he wanted to hurt people for a very long time, and Carol, Jolee, Sylvina, and Joey were simply at the wrong place at the wrong time. He didn't care who his target was, but he did prefer if they were female. In Cary's possession, investigators found these recordings that he took before and after the victims' deaths, and in all of those recordings, he's completely emotionless. I tried playing around with it so that I can play the recording for you all here, but no matter how I messed around with it, it kept getting picked up for age restriction. So if you are curious, feel free to search it up yourself, it's very easy to find. Ultimately, Cary pleaded not guilty. His attorneys tried to get him a lighter sentence by arguing that he was insane. They called back to the period in which Stephen had been kidnapped, saying that it caused permanent damage to him psychologically, and that violence was simply a means for him to vent and release the pain he was going through. There was even this moment that Cary said he would confess to all 4 murders if he was given explicit material involving minors, which is just a crazy thing to say. I don't know if he was actually expecting to get something out of that, but he was sentenced to death in 2002 and he is currently on death row. This next entry takes us over to Indonesia in March of 2017. There was a young man, aged 25, named Akbar Salubiro who lived in a village on the island called Sulawesi. Akbar spent his days gathering palm fruit from these large trees with a long pole that had this sort of hook at the end. On March 25th, Akbar worked for a longer period than usual. Several of his family members were out, so Akbar wouldn't have anything to do back home if he left the fruit trees early. So he stayed later and worked into the night. And if you're not aware, there are some crazy animals in Indonesia and their pythons are massive. They can grow upwards of 20 feet. Usually, Akbar would work alongside some other people in the area, but again, this time around, Akbar worked much later, so everyone had left the area. This, paired alongside all of the cover that nature provided, allowed for a massive python to sneak up on him. With precision, power, and speed, it locked its mouth onto Akbar and coiled its body around him, and it's chalked at this point, especially since Akbar was all alone. The python's mouth expanded and Akbar was completely consumed. His family returned home later and were confused to see that he wasn't there. Believing that he was simply out working late, which he was, Akbar's family just went to sleep. The next day, Akbar was still nowhere to be seen, and when his co-workers started arriving at the forest to harvest palm fruit, they too started asking each other if anyone had seen Akbar. But nobody had, so authorities were contacted and a search for Akbar began. After learning from his family that he never returned on the night of the 25th, the search was focused in the forest where Akbar worked. After several hours of searching, there were finally signs of Akbar. A group of men had found one of his boots as well as that pole he carried to knock down palm fruit. However, nearby was something that really scared the group of men. There was this huge trail, and of course locals immediately knew what left it. They feared that Akbar had been attacked by a massive python. The search groups came together and started focusing down the path of that python trail, and it didn't take long for them to find a huge 300-pound python that was really misshapen. The group of men opened it up and right there just plopped out Akbar. I'm not going to show you the image of Akbar being removed for obvious reasons, but if you really want to see it, it's easily found on Google. The first image of it is already pretty messed up in my mind, and unfortunately Akbar was long gone by the time he was found. This final entry takes us over to Wales in the year 2010 with a 15-year-old girl named Rebecca Aylward. She had a boyfriend named Joshua Davies that she had met a couple of years ago around the age of 13. The two got to know each other really well and started a deeper relationship with each other at the age of 14. To all of Rebecca's friends and family, Joshua was a completely normal kid. He did have a hobby of collecting guns and knives, which worried Rebecca's sister. This concern then increased when Rebecca told her sister that Joshua, quote-unquote, playfully threatened her while holding one of his knives. Rebecca took it as a joke, but her sister thought that Joshua had some darker urges that he was holding back. After being together for several months, Rebecca asked her parents if Joshua could stay over at their house for a couple of days. Her parents were a bit skeptical, but in the end allowed him to stay over. Everyone said that they had a great time with each other's company, and Joshua seemed like a good kid. He was polite, outgoing, and had a good sense of humor. Joshua stayed at the Aylward residence for one weekend, and after saying his goodbyes to the family and returning home, he made a text. The message was sent to Rebecca, and it said that he wanted to break up. This text came as a complete shock. The relationship between the two seemed to be going smoothly, and Joshua was well liked by her family, and her family liked Joshua back. Just what caused this abrupt decision? Rebecca pushed back and asked why, but Joshua wouldn't reveal much, so all Rebecca could do was accept it. However, Joshua didn't leave her alone after the breakup. Strangely, he actually started to harass Rebecca. There were even rumors spreading around school saying that Rebecca was pregnant, rumors that were started by Joshua. Later reports from Joshua's friends even highlighted that he wanted to take Rebecca's life. This was a wild thing to say, and being teenagers, his friends thought that Joshua was just being edgy. One of his friends went along with what he thought was a joke and offered Joshua free breakfast if he went through with it. Luckily, there were some mutual friends between Rebecca and Joshua that told Joshua to stop. Nobody understood why he was being a bully. Joshua also started hanging out with this new girl, and when Rebecca saw the two, she simply thought that this was his new girlfriend. This was sort of enough for Rebecca to finally move on from Joshua, but of course deep down she did still have feelings for him because she never really got any closure on why the relationship ended. The school year eventually came to an end, and Joshua seemed to have moved on from Rebecca and rarely interacted with her. Even the bullying seemed to stop. Fast forward to the next school year, Joshua started to become interested in Rebecca once more. That girl that Joshua was seeing disappeared from his life as well, so on the surface, it seemed that he wanted to try building a relationship with Rebecca again. And as I said earlier, Rebecca still had feelings for Joshua, so she listened to almost anything he said. One day in late October 2010, Joshua asked Rebecca if she could visit the woods with him, and without any hesitation, Rebecca said yes. The two agreed to meet each other on the 23rd. That morning, Joshua was hanging out with some friends, and after checking the time, he got up from the table they were all sitting at and left. He was headed for the woods. Meanwhile, Rebecca was putting on makeup and deciding on which outfit to put on for what she thought was a date. Once she was all ready, she said her goodbyes to her family and headed out. Rebecca had told her mom about the meeting with Joshua, and she was also well aware of all the terrible things that he had said and done to Rebecca. So understandably, Rebecca's mother was worried about her. When Rebecca got to the woods, she received a phone call from her mother. She just wanted to make sure that Rebecca was alright and Joshua didn't have anything bad planned. Rebecca told her that Joshua hadn't arrived yet, so her mom stayed on the phone with her. A few minutes passed and Joshua showed up. Rebecca hung up the phone and the two walked deeper into the woods. Around this time, Joshua had also sent a text to a friend of his, and I have gotten like 4 to 5 different variations of what this text was, but it said something to the extent of, "I'll be expecting that breakfast soon." As the two walked deeper and deeper into the wilderness, Joshua eventually started trailing behind a little bit. He turned left to right and looked behind him to make sure that no one else was around. Then he bent over and picked up a rock and struck Rebecca with it. The two wrestled each other on the ground, and Rebecca was actually able to break free from Joshua and run off. However, Joshua was able to quickly recover and land the finishing blow before Rebecca could escape completely. Rebecca never returned home, so her mother suspected that Joshua really had done something terrible. Rebecca was reported missing, and her mother was able to get in touch with Joshua. She asked him if he knew where Rebecca was, and Joshua lied, saying that he had not seen her that day at all. He faked a concerned voice and said that he was at his grandma's the entire day. A couple of days would pass with no sign of Rebecca, and during that time, Joshua was sending texts to Rebecca's phone to sell the illusion that he had no idea where she was, but he was worried. One of Joshua's friends found out that Rebecca was missing, and he recalled all of the terrible things he did to Rebecca. This friend thought to himself, what are the chances that Joshua is actually responsible for her disappearance? Another student pointed out that Joshua had changed his profile picture on social media to this forested area nearby. Then others said that Joshua and Rebecca met at that same location in the profile picture. Several of Joshua's friends started connecting the dots and shared their thoughts with authorities. Investigators visited the woods and indeed they found Rebecca's remains. This photo is one of the last times that Joshua and Rebecca were seen together happy before Joshua ended up taking her life. And Joshua didn't really have a good reason for it. He did it just because he could. Ultimately, at Swansea Crown Court, he received a life sentence where he would have to serve a minimum of 14 in prison. Initially, Joshua actually denied being responsible. In fact, he tried to shift all of the blame to one of his friends. It was only about 8 years into his life sentence where he finally confessed. Sean Vincent Gillis was born on June 24th, 1962, and is one of the many notorious serial killers in Baton Rouge, Louisiana during the late 90s and mid-2000s. Sean's father had walked out on him and his mother at a young age, leading to Sean being raised primarily by his biological mother, Yvonne, and his grandmother. And normally, I would probably say the dad is a POS for doing this, but in this case, the absence of his dad was probably better for Sean, oddly enough. Although I'm not sure if better is the right word to use here, as Sean still turned out to be a monster, but his dad was a terrible person who was frequently involved in a lot of sketchy activities. Sean's criminal history can be traced back to the 80s at the age of about 16 to 17, when Sean had been arrested for a variety of reasons, including DUI, possession of illegal substances, other traffic violations, and more. However, it wouldn't be until his 30s that Sean would give in to his carnal desires. And unfortunately, his desires didn't stop at just murder. It gets much worse. Later on, he shared that he had a lot of dark thoughts at a very young age. Sometimes these thoughts even involved his family members. Neighbors and students who grew up near Sean said that he was basically a bully and just a menace to society, even at a young age. After graduating high school, Sean didn't know what to do next. He went out and got a part-time job to have some money to spend. At the same time, he enrolled himself in a community college, which didn't result in any career for Sean. The next decade or so of his life would gradually disappear, with Sean not accomplishing or pursuing anything. During that entire time, he lived at home with his mother, but one day his mom was contacted by people in Atlanta with a job proposal. Yvonne accepted. However, this job was in Atlanta, so she had to leave Sean alone. She regularly sent money back to Sean as well, since at this point, at the age of 30, Sean wasn't able to keep any of his jobs for very long. And one of the reasons that he constantly hopped around was because of his crippling addiction, which started around his teenage years. Pair this with a mentally unwell man that is prone to having violent thoughts, well, you're going to get an awful outcome. Fast forward to 1994, Sean Gillis met a woman named Terry Lemoyne, and the two didn't like each other at first. Terry had slapped Sean on their first date, which set off the waterworks, and for whatever reason, Terry told Sean they could go out on another date if he stopped crying. The two build a relationship where Terry gets a good idea of Sean's daily life. She was aware of Sean's obsession with stuff like but she did not know the dark thoughts in his head. These thoughts, which have been brewing for years, finally manifested in March of the same year. In Baton Rouge, there's this exclusive retirement home called St. James Place. Inside it lived a woman named Anne Bryan who was in her 80s. Sean saw Anne and decided that she would be his first victim. He planned to rape her. Sean had never met Anne before, so this was all a spur of the moment type event. Sean sneaks into Anne's residence but can't subdue Anne quietly. She was alerted to Sean's presence and screamed for help. Sean, having never actually attempted this sort of thing before, panicked and took Anne's life. Everything was a blur, and he stabbed Anne over 50 times all over. Sean was able to flee the area, and no one suspected him of the crime at first. Around this time, Terry observed a change in the content that Sean indulged in. Suddenly, Sean started frequently visiting sites that offered much more graphic content. Terry, however, thought that as long as this was nothing more than a fantasy and he kept to himself, then it was no issue. For the next 5 years, Sean essentially went silent. Then in January 1999, Sean struck again. This victim was named Catherine Hall. Catherine was a sex worker who got into Sean's car after the promise of money. Sean had attempted to strangle Catherine, but she was able to slip out of his grasp. But when she attempted to open the door and run off, Sean reached for his knife and attacked Catherine. After he was sure that Catherine was dead, Sean proceeded to assault the body. He also mutilated Catherine afterward before leaving her at a construction site next to a dead-end sign. The following incident occurred in May of 1999. One day, Sean was out in Baton Rouge and saw a woman jogging. Sean was instantly enamored by her and planned out his next attack. This woman was named Hardy Schmidt, but each time Sean was ready to attack, Hardy would either be with someone or the area just wouldn't be safe enough for him to commit a crime. So he spent several weeks just shadowing Hardy, waiting for an opening. This opening arrived on May 30th at about 5:30 a.m. Hardy was yet again out for a jog, and Sean just rammed into her with his car. This sent her flying, and Sean quickly got out and wrapped this thick plastic wrap around her head before shoving her into his car. Because of the car hitting her, Hardy had sort of become stunned, unable to comprehend what was happening to her. Sean took the 52-year-old to a secluded park where he and murdered her. Sean didn't immediately dispose of the remains, but instead waited 2 days before abandoning Hardy. Neither Hardy nor Catherine's murders were tied to Anne Bryan, but all of the crime scenes had traces of DNA evidence. The problem was that investigators did not have Sean's DNA in their official records, so they weren't able to match it up to him. Then in November of the same year, Sean had taken another life. This one was 26-year-old Joyce Williams, who had been strangled. The murders continued into the year 2000, starting with 52-year-old Lillian Robinson. Sean had also assaulted Lillian's body after death, just like with Catherine Hall. Then another victim named Marilyn Nevels, aged 38, had also been killed in October of 2000. It was later revealed during an interrogation that is actually available on YouTube that Sean liked to consume parts of his victims. I listened to portions of the interrogations, and it's just really chilling listening to this man describe events such as his victims after their deaths. He even bathed with a few of them. And if you have watched, I believe, the most recent Police Sketches video, you'll remember I mentioned a man named Derek Todd Lee. He was also one of the more notorious serial killers at the time in Baton Rouge, but Derek Lee and Sean Gillis were not the only killers at the time. They're just two of the more well-known killers. During the 90s and 2000s, Baton Rouge was plagued with crime, and I believe someone commented under that other video saying that even today, that city still has a lot of crime going on. So with that in mind, investigators had their hands full. There was so much crime happening that it was tough to sort out who killed whom. In fact, investigators thought that Derek was responsible for Sean's murders as well. And funny enough, when Sean was finally apprehended and investigators went through his computer, they found a folder under the name Derek Todd Lee. After Derek was arrested, Sean had been researching all that he had done and kept it all in that folder. Then there were also other photos that he had taken of himself, likely right after he committed some of his crimes. After the death of Marilyn Nevels, Sean had yet again gone on a sort of break. This time, it lasted until October of 2003, when Sean had taken the life of 45-year-old Johnny Mae Williams, which was then followed by the death of 43-year-old Donna Bennett Johnston in February of 2004. And both of these women were also subjected to the same cruel post-mortem routines that I mentioned throughout this segment. But it is with the discovery of Donna's remains that authorities would finally start connecting some of these cases. Sean had ditched Donna in this muddy drainage area near Louisiana State University. After recovering the remains, investigators found some tire tracks nearby. Photos were taken of the tracks and experts were brought in to check them out in person. It was determined that a particularly uncommon Goodyear tire, which was only produced for a short window, had left these tracks. This then resulted in a list of transactions that involved this set of tires. Amongst the names associated with those transactions was Sean Gillis. One by one, authorities visited each of the people on the list and got their DNA to test against the DNA associated with their unsolved cases, and inevitably, the DNA was matched to Sean. A subsequent search warrant was issued, and the authorities were able to sweep through the home where Sean and his girlfriend Terry were living. And during the search, investigators found a bunch of photographs of Sean's victims. Hidden away in various corners of the residence were also parts of the victims. Sean had kept these body parts sort of as trophies or mementos to take him back to those moments so that he could replay them in his head. Surprisingly, almost immediately, Sean admitted to the horrible crimes he had committed. During one of his interrogations, he was quoted saying, "I'm sorry I hurt people, but I would do it again. You let me out on the street. I'll find somebody before sundown. If anything in my useless life comes out, help the little girls today not to be the premature corpses of tomorrow." Sean's mother attempted to defend him by saying that he was a kind man who didn't cause anybody any trouble. But as we all know, this is just not the case. In April of 2004, he received several life sentences. Some wanted to pursue the death penalty, however, that didn't end up happening. Currently, Sean is in the Louisiana State Penitentiary. The woman you are currently seeing on screen was named Nirupama Prajapati. Nirupama went out to visit a river located in Kanakunda in western India. It was early January 2021 when she and her friends made the trip out to the Grand Canyon of Odisha. That selfie you saw was taken just moments before Nirupama's life ended. Other tourists were also in the area, and one of them recorded the moment when a man slipped on the rocks and knocked Nirupama into the river. The water was much too strong for Nirupama to get her footing and stand up, and there wasn't much the other tourists could do to help her either. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. By the time the others realized what was happening, the current had carried Nirupama out of reach. Quickly, officials were called and a search team was formed to find Nirupama. And after nearly an entire day of searching, Nirupama was finally located. The stream had carried her about a quarter of a mile from where she had fallen. Her body had snagged onto a large rock. When the incident made its rounds on the internet, the public was also informed that this was not the first time someone had died trying to secure selfies near the water. This next entry will take us over to Denmark, specifically Copenhagen, in the year 2017. Peter Madsen is the name of an entrepreneur turned murderer. He was born on January 12th, 1971. Peter's mother, Annie, was about 30 years younger than her husband, Carl, and had a few other children from past relationships. It was rumored that Carl did not particularly like his stepchildren and at times even abused them. Eventually, Carl's relationship with Annie turned sour and the two split, with Annie taking the kids. Peter was about 6 years old when this occurred. However, several years down the line, Peter was able to get back in touch with his father, and the two bonded over their shared interest in rockets. Now, this wasn't just some normal interest that faded with age. No, Peter was genuinely fascinated with technology, so he would go to various camps and special classes over the years and build his first rocket in March of 1986. Or rather, not his first rocket, but the first rocket of significant size. Then, just 3 years after that event, Peter's father passed away. In the early to mid-2000s, Peter had built 3 submarines: the UC-1 Freya, UC-2 Kraka, and the UC-3 Nautilus, the latter of which was launched in May of 2008. That same year, Peter co-founded a space program called Copenhagen Suborbitals before leaving it behind in 2014. That same year, he created a new group called Rocket Madsen Space Lab. That's pretty much the gist of Peter's backstory. He's a pretty brilliant man. Now, I want to introduce a woman named Kim Wall. She was a 30-year-old Swedish freelance journalist born on March 23rd, 1987 in Trelleborg, Sweden. Her mother was also a journalist and her father was a photographer, which played a role in Kim wanting to pursue journalism. Kim traveled the world, writing articles and stories about anything that interested her. And it just so happened that she was interested in Peter's work, but every attempt she made to get in touch with Peter for an interview failed. That was until she received a message. It was August 10th, 2017, when Kim visited Copenhagen to hang out with some friends. A farewell party had been planned, and during it, Kim received a text message from Peter Madsen himself. Kim was ecstatic and thought to herself that she had finally secured an interview. So she opened up the text and it was an invitation from Peter to join him on his submarine, the UC-3 Nautilus. Peter told Kim that he had about 2 hours to spare for whatever she wanted to ask. Kim let her boyfriend Ole Stab know that she was going to head out with Peter to finally do that interview she'd been trying to secure. When asked how long she'd be gone for, Kim said that she'd be back in no more than a few hours. The photos you see on screen are the last ones taken of her before she and Peter set out in the Nautilus. After some time had passed, Ole Stab had received a text message from Kim. It said, "I'm alive by the way, now we're going to go down. I love you." He brought coffee and cookies. Some more time went by and Ole sent a text to check in on Kim, but she never responded. Before he knew it, it was 10:30 and a couple of hours had passed since Kim had left with Peter. So Ole was expecting the pair to return soon. But after visiting the pier where the Nautilus had left, there was no sign of them. Ole waited a bit longer and at this point, he wasn't all that concerned. He thought that the interview was simply going very well, and Kim wanted to keep asking questions. But then more hours passed. At about 2 a.m., Ole finally called authorities. The Coast Guard was also contacted and tried to communicate with Peter's submarine, but they also received no response. Everyone's first thought was that the submarine had some sort of accident underwater, so several search parties were sent out to search for it. The very next morning, around 10:30 a.m., Peter and his submarine were spotted. However, the submarine was actually sinking. Kim was nowhere to be seen. When Peter was asked if everything was okay, he said yeah. Then he was asked where Kim was. Peter responded by saying he had dropped her off along the bay before the sub had sunk. Investigators didn't buy this. But surprisingly, that same day, they actually charged Peter with manslaughter. They believed that Peter had killed Kim Wall. Investigators swept through the area where Peter claimed to have left Kim, but they couldn't find any sign of the woman. They also visited several of the local businesses there to see if they had seen Kim or if their cameras had picked her up. And as you probably expected, none of the employees saw her and the cameras didn't see Kim either. And this is where things get very interesting. When Peter was brought into court, he changed his story. Instead of leaving her on the bay, Peter said that Kim had actually died. According to him, shortly after the two had set out, Kim had banged her head against a hatch, which killed her. Peter was in a panic and didn't know what he should do, so he roamed the waters aimlessly before tossing Kim overboard. Meanwhile, the Nautilus was being investigated by officials who stated that they believed it was with a high likelihood that the sub was purposely sabotaged. However, they couldn't find Kim herself inside of the sub, but her blood was inside of it, and there was a lot of blood. Then on August 21st, a torso was discovered on the shore not too far from where the Nautilus used to be docked. The torso was discovered by a man riding his bike, and it was later confirmed to belong to Kim. And here's the thing, there were numerous knife wounds on Kim's body, 15 to be exact, and a bunch of those wounds were left around Kim's reproductive organs. Then, in October of the same year, the rest of Kim's remains were discovered one by one at the bottom of Koje Bay. They were all bagged up with heavy metal pieces inside to weigh them down. Even the knife that Peter used was found. Investigators stated that they believed Peter restrained Kim when they went underwater before ultimately taking her life. After this discovery was made public, Peter finally admitted to taking Kim's life. But what exactly caused this seemingly random attack from Peter? Peter Madsen appeared to be an entirely ordinary individual enjoying a successful career in a field he was genuinely passionate about. It turned out that Peter had a much darker side. Authorities searched Peter's residence, and on his computer, they found dozens of snuff videos. When this discovery was mentioned during interviews with Peter's peers, they revealed that Peter often took part in parties and had a fetish involving sadism. In March 2018, Peter's trial began, and it lasted until late April of the same year. Peter pleaded not guilty. Peter yet again switched up the story. This time around, Peter claimed that Kim Wall had died as a result of carbon monoxide poisoning. He was ultimately charged with Kim's death along with a flurry of other crimes and received a life sentence. But this story doesn't end here. His stay in prison turned out to be quite eventful. He even got himself a girlfriend. It was some random female guard. So in October 2020, Peter was actually able to escape from prison, but he was later caught. He was found with a sort of a makeshift firearm and what looked like explosives strapped to him. These explosives later turned out to just be fakes, however. Living in Monument, Colorado was a 13-year-old boy named Dylan Redwine who lived with his mother Elaine and brother Corey. Dylan was one of the many unfortunate children who had to experience his parents separating at a young age. He regularly went on court-ordered visits with his father, Mark Redwine, who resided in the rugged and mountainous landscape of La Plata County, nestled in the southwestern area of Colorado. And you may assume that a son would rejoice whenever he gets the chance to spend more time with a parent that he isn't always with. However, this was not the case with Dylan. Dylan found little to no joy in spending time with his father and had intentionally avoided these encounters for several months. The root cause of this can be traced back to a distressing incident that occurred at his father's house the previous year. In the summer of 2011, specifically in June, Dylan, accompanied by his older brother Corey, visited his father's home. While the brothers were using their father's laptop, they inadvertently stumbled upon some very disturbing images. At the time, Mark was asleep, so the brothers took the laptop and ran to the bathroom and locked themselves in. Displayed on the screen were images of their father Mark clad in a wig and woman's lingerie, cradling what seemed to be a soiled diaper. The brothers went through all of the images, and that's when they realized something. Their father appeared to be consuming the contents of the diaper. Corey brought out his phone and took pictures of these unsettling images, marking a turning point in how Dylan perceived his father. So over the following year, Dylan distanced himself, becoming more withdrawn and fighting with the decision to confront his father about this discovery. On November 19th, 2012, a court mandate made Dylan visit his father for Thanksgiving. Dylan's mother Elaine didn't really want to send him off though, since she recognized he changed in his behavior. He was showing obvious signs of distress stress and discomfort. For what reason though, she had no idea. In the end, Dylan agreed, but before he went off, he went to his brother Corey and gave him a request. Dylan asked him to send over those images that they took from their father's laptop. Dylan was mustering up the courage and confidence to ask his father about these images and hopefully share the information with his brother Corey when he got back. However, Corey would never get to see his brother ever again. On November 18th, 2012, Mark Redwine picked up his son from the airport. Surveillance footage at both the airport and a local Walmart in Durango showed little interaction between the father and son. Apparently, Dylan asked his father if he could spend the night with a friend upon arrival, but Mark insisted otherwise and they both spent the evening at Mark's residence. Through text messages, Dylan organized a visit to his friend's house at around 6:30 a.m. the following morning, with his last known communication on his phone occurring at 9:37 p.m. the previous night. When Dylan's friend texted him at around 6:46 a.m. on November 19th, asking about where he was, there was no response. On the night of November 19th, 2012, Mark reported that his 13-year-old son, Dylan, was missing. News of Dylan's disappearance spread fast, leading to a large search and rescue operation. After Dylan went missing, his dad acted in a way that seemed strange for a parent whose child is lost. Mark stayed home and he didn't even try to find Dylan. When media went to interview him, he seemed rather withdrawn. Months were invested into the search effort, but due to the rough terrain and high elevation of Durango, little success was made. Despite numerous efforts to locate him, Dylan remained missing and no new information came in about his whereabouts. On January 31st, 2013, Mark participated in an exclusive interview blaming himself for his son's disappearance. According to Mark, Dylan was asleep when he woke up that morning, and upon returning from running some errands, he discovered that his son was missing. Now, the public initially sympathized with the father, not knowing any better, but the public will soon learn how undeserving Mark was of this sympathy. On June 26, 2013, the case would make new headlines, but not for the reasons people were hoping for. Human remains, including a segment of Dylan's shirt and a sock, were unearthed in a secluded location on Middle Mountain, roughly 8 miles from Mark's home. Following some testing, it was determined that the recovered remains were indeed those of the missing Dylan Redwine. When the search parties were informed about the location in which Dylan was found, they were taken aback as that particular area was very difficult to get to. It was tough to believe that a child who was unfamiliar with the area was able to find their way to it. This prompted the suspicion that foul play was involved. Mark Redwine subsequently became a person of interest and the cause of his son's death was officially labeled as undetermined. Investigators uncovered traces of Dylan's blood in various parts of Mark's home, including the laundry room, living room, and kitchen. However, Mark vehemently denied any connection to his son's death. Only on November 1st, 2015, a full 2 years later, was Dylan's skull located. Autopsy findings indicated that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Nearly 2 years following the grim discovery, on July 22nd, 2017, Mark was apprehended in Bellingham, Washington. He faced charges of second-degree murder and child abuse related to Dylan's death. Following multiple delays, Mark's trial commenced on June 14, 2021. The defense argued that the minimal amount of blood discovered in Mark's kitchen was infinitesimally small and could have occurred in any household. Defense attorney John Moran went further, asserting that using dog-sniffing death scent techniques was deemed quote-unquote junk science. Despite the defense's effort to explain Dylan's death as an accident, proposing that he might have wandered off and met his end due to the elements or an animal attack, Mark was declared guilty on all charges on July 16th. The unsettling photos presented to the jury played a crucial role in the verdict. It was ruled that Mark Redwine killed his son in a fit of rage after being shown the images. He was sentenced to 48 years in prison on October 8th, 2021. Dylan's mother and brother were devastated, and Corey said the following: "It's been nothing short of misery over the years." Corey also often thinks about how he could have helped protect Dylan. He said, "I can't bring Dylan back. I can't talk to Dylan, so I pray to him. I dream of him. Dylan is my hero and became more of a man in 13 years than Mark became in 60. At approximately 9:30 p.m. on June 3, 1991, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a trucker named Eduardo Colin decided to call it a night and checked into a Super 8 motel. The motel staff observed that Eduardo appeared to be alone, yet he requested a room suitable for 2 people. Eduardo paid in cash for a one-night stay and was instructed to check out by 11 a.m. the following morning. He nodded, smiled, and proceeded toward his room. Throughout his stay, there was no communication from Eduardo. However, a few days later, motel staff noticed that Eduardo hadn't checked out. Finding this unusual, they sent a security guard to investigate why Eduardo hadn't left. Upon reaching the room, the guard saw a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. He knocked but received no response. Attempting to turn the knob, he found out that the door was locked. After some effort using a screwdriver, the guard gained entry, but he realized the room was completely empty. On the table, there were bottles of beer, cigarettes, and several other items that didn't initially raise any concern. The guard continued his investigation and made his way into the bathroom. There, he made a grim discovery. Secured to the shower head was the lifeless body of a woman. Despite clear signs of decay, medical investigators were certain that this unidentified woman had passed away on the very same day Eduardo checked into the motel. Additionally, traces of illicit substances were found in her body, and the image you're seeing on screen right now is the photo that was found on the room desk. The unsettling nature is the one detail most often remembered about the case. The woman appeared to be in her mid-20s to early 30s and stood at about 5 foot 7 inches tall. When motel staff was shown the image, they didn't recognize the woman, although they confirmed that the man in the photo was indeed Eduardo. Despite obtaining Eduardo's personal information from the motel staff and confirming that it was legitimate for the most part, it would take a couple of years before police could locate him, or rather they would find his family. And it turned out that Eduardo had died, but here's the confusing part. Police pulled out that photograph from the motel and shared it with the family, but they stated that the man in the picture was not Eduardo. They also had no idea who the woman was. So if this man was not Eduardo, then who could it be? Investigators went back to look at all of the clues and evidence that they had, and there was one piece that may shed some light on the case. On that motel room table, there was a scale with the name George Martinez written on it. Investigators believed that the device was used primarily to organize illegal substances. This gave rise to theories suggesting that the female may have been a victim in a deal gone wrong. In an attempt to gather new information from the public about either people in the photo, the original version was altered. In this updated photograph, which is oddly enough even more unsettling, the woman appears with a more neutral expression. Fast forward to March 2021, police received a tip that suggested that the woman was named Becca and that she was originally from California. And to my knowledge, this possible identity was never heavily looked into and was thus never confirmed. As for the man, police still have zero idea who he is and have yet to identify him. When Becca's body was discovered, it was believed that she had taken her own life, but there are now many people that suspect foul play was involved. Andrew McCauley was an Australian mountaineer and sea kayaker born on August 7, 1968. Andrew was a very ambitious individual that strived for the toughest of goals set by himself. In fact, in 2003, Andrew made the first non-stop crossing of Bass Strait via kayak. The very next year, he kayaked across the Gulf of Carpentaria. 2 years after that, he led an expedition in the Australian Antarctic Territory where the group crossed over 800 kilometers. It was becoming clear that Andrew was much too skilled for his own good. He needed that next challenge to really test himself. He set the goal of crossing the Tasman Sea in a standard one-man kayak without any outside help. Now, it should be stated that this has been done before, but those adventurers all had custom kayaks that were built for extreme conditions. If successful, the journey was well over 900 miles and would take over a month to complete. Not only was the challenge going to be long, but it was also going to put his mentality to the test, as Andrew was going to have little to nothing to eat or drink. Andrew would set off for his attempt in December of 2006, but quit only a night later. The reason being that the kayak was freezing cold and Andrew had no way of preserving any heat in his kayak. Luckily, Andrew was able to get home safely, but this small hiccup was not going to keep him away from the sea for very long, as he would return to it in January of the next year. This time around, Andrew was all ready to combat the extreme temperatures that he would face out at sea. Andrew would frequently contact his family via radio and let them know that he was doing great. He was about halfway done with the journey, and it seemed like smooth sailing from there on out. However, things would take a turn for the worse very quickly. As Andrew was nearing the end, violent waves began to crash into his kayak, suddenly making the latter half of the trip significantly more difficult. This was not to mention the other conditions which have also worsened. And keep in mind, Andrew wanted to beat this challenge with a normal run-of-the-mill kayak. It was February 9th when Andrew made an emergency call saying, "Do you copy? This is kayak 1. Do you copy? Over. I've got an emergency situation. I'm in a kayak about 30 kilometers from Milford Sound. I need a rescue. My kayak's sinking. Fell off into the sea and I'm going down." But rescue would not find Andrew until it was too late. In fact, they would never find Andrew at all, but what they did find was his kayak, bobbing in the sea about 30 nautical miles from the journey's endpoint. This discovery was made on February 12th. I want to quickly mention that Andrew's kayak came with this fiberglass dome cover that was supposed to provide shelter for him. Now, whenever his kayak would flip over due to the way the dome was constructed, Andrew needed to exit the kayak and flip it over manually. It's believed that Andrew somehow lost this dome, ultimately leading to his demise. Andrew's remains were never located, but on the kayak were these photos that he took of himself in his final moments. In Star City, West Virginia, lived Skylar Neese, a 16-year-old girl with her parents David and Mary. During her childhood, Skylar had a best friend named Morgan Lawrence. In the earlier years of their friendship, the two were inseparable, but just like with most friendships from such a young age, it dwindled as the two grew older. Nevertheless, Morgan still saw Skylar as someone in her circle, almost like a family member. Another close friend of Skylar's was named Sheila Eddy. Together, the two girls started high school and met another girl named Rachel Schoaf. This group of girls went on to grow very close and hung out with each other whenever they could. Teachers and classmates did mention that the group tended to be rather rambunctious, and there were even rumors that they would use illegal substances and partake in underage drinking at parties. Fast forward to July 6th, 2012, Skylar went to a local Wendy's where she worked. This particular shift took place well into the night, so she didn't return home until very late. But when she did, she immediately went to her room and went to sleep. The next day, Skylar's dad, David, knocked on Skylar's bedroom door but received no response. In fact, the door had been locked. David was able to eventually get past the door with the use of a coat hanger, but to his shock, Skylar was nowhere to be found. He immediately called his wife Mary to inform her that their daughter was missing, but Mary seemed to not think much of this and told David that she was probably hanging out with some friends. So David calmed down a little and went out for a smoke. That's when he noticed that Skylar's bedroom window was wide open, and outside of the house at the bottom of the window was a little stool. David thought to himself that Skylar had just snuck out in the middle of the night and was intending to use the stool to get back inside, so he just left it and went about his day. After about 6 hours, Skylar's family members were surprised to receive a call from Skylar's manager saying that she had not shown up for work. At this point, Skylar's family was beginning to panic. Never once had Skylar ever missed work or even arrived late, so they called the police. When police searched Skylar's room, they noticed that most of her personal items had been left behind, indicating that she did intend to return. Around this time is when Skylar's friend Sheila called the family. She was crying non-stop, saying that Skylar, Rachel, and herself went out last night, and when they were going to return home, Skylar asked to be dropped off at a street corner instead of her house. Sheila claimed that this happened just before midnight and she has not heard from Skylar since, which at the time of the call would have meant about 18 hours had passed. So obviously, now everyone was beginning to think that Skylar had been kidnapped. Police were able to get their hands on some CCTV footage which shows Skylar running towards a 3-door car and getting into the back seat. This footage was captured right behind the house. Sheila said that the vehicle was not hers and that she did not recognize it. Unfortunately, police were not able to track down the vehicle, but they did assume that it belonged to someone that Skylar knew as she voluntarily entered it. To the police, this appeared as though Skylar was a runaway teen. Then on July 11th, there was news that somewhere in North Carolina was a girl who appeared to be Skylar, accompanied by a red-haired girl. Being that she was red-haired, everyone thought that this other girl was Rachel, which just confused more people as Rachel was supposed to be at a church camp. However, Rachel would return home from camp, and during her interview, investigators noticed that she was unnaturally nervous. It was during their questioning that they realized either Rachel or Sheila isn't telling the truth. You see, the police asked Sheila to take them through the path that they took to return home that night. Then they did the same thing with Rachel, and they both gave different stories. It was noted that the girls were in Blacksville around 4 a.m. and Rachel claimed that they were there to smoke. Then Skylar requested that she be dropped off at a friend's to get some other substances. The other girls said okay and dropped her off at Skylar's friend's house. Sheila revealed a similar story, but there was one key difference. Sheila said that Skylar left by herself to her friend's house and they haven't seen her since. The very next day, Sheila retracted the statement and said that she and Rachel did in fact drop Skylar off. The investigation continued and police were of the opinion that Sheila and Rachel definitely knew more than they were letting on. But it wasn't like police had any hard evidence to charge them with. So about 5 months after Skylar's disappearance, Rachel began showing signs of instability. Her mental health was rapidly declining and she began lashing out at people for very stupid reasons. She was sent to a psychiatric unit and let out in less than a week. After being let out, she immediately ran to the police and said, "We stabbed her." Investigators asked her to elaborate and Rachel said that she and Sheila filled up a car with cleaning supplies, shovels, and new clothing. The vehicle belonged to Sheila and the two asked Skylar to come hang out and they drove out to Greene County, Pennsylvania. There, the three girls roamed into the woods and jumped Skylar. Both Rachel and Sheila said that on the count of 3, they would stab her to death. They pulled out knives that they had hidden in their hoodies and easily overpowered Skylar. But Skylar was able to break Rachel's knife out of her grip and drive it into Rachel's ankle, which caused her to screech and run off. While Rachel retreated, Sheila remained and continued her attack, all while her friend screamed out, "Why?" When the two murderers were sure that Skylar was no longer alive, they tried to bury her, but later settled for leaving her under some leaves and scraps. Then the two just drove off and continued with their lives. So surely the two must have had a very good reason for doing something so rash and evil. When investigators asked Rachel why they did it, she simply said, "We just didn't like her anymore." Police were able to locate Skylar's remains on January 16th, 2013. But one strange thing about the case was, even though Sheila knew that her crimes were revealed, she attempted to avoid reality online. For example, she would upload a photo of the trio with the caption, "Rest easy Skylar, you'll always be my best friend." Officials struggled at securing a true motive from the duo, but there were a couple of theories. One of which seemed to be that Skylar knew some secrets about Sheila and Rachel and those two didn't want her to reveal them. Skylar's diary also hinted at this possibility. Sheila pled not guilty, but was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Rachel pled guilty and received a reduced sentence of 30 years. Now, apparently, Rachel actually got married in prison in the women's only facility, and the reason I'm telling you this is because one of those secrets that Skylar possibly held was Rachel and Sheila's romantic relationship. It was speculated that the primary reason that Sheila and Rachel agreed to take their friend's life was because they believed they wouldn't be accepted if they were exposed. However, neither one has confirmed this. The photo you are seeing on screen right now is of 6-year-old Madsen Jamison and is the final photo ever taken of her before she went missing along with her mother Sherilyn and father Bobby. The family disappeared after scheduling what seemed to be an appointment to view a large 40-acre property located near Red Oak, Oklahoma. At some point during this trip, the entire family just vanished, and it wasn't until about a week afterward when they were finally reported missing. According to friends and family, Bobby and Sherilyn seemed to be living above their means. The couple was also extremely religious, even going as far as to say that they feared their home was going to be raided by evil spirits in the future. Both Sherilyn and Bobby also had health issues. Bobby was in a car accident in 2003 which resulted in chronic back pain. Sherilyn had frequent bouts of depression ever since her sister's death. She was later diagnosed with bipolar disorder and was known to avoid her medication at times. Then in October of 2009 is when the family entertained the idea of moving to a different location that was more rural. They eventually set their sights on that plot of land I mentioned earlier, which was located in the San Bois Mountains. Bobby proposed the idea that they could live out there in metal shipping containers, so they set up the appointment to take a closer look at the area, but they had one strange request for the real estate agent. Both Bobby and Sherilyn stated that they wanted to go alone and didn't want the agent to attend. The reason why was never found out. The family was last seen on October 9th, 2009, and again, it took a little while before anyone noticed that the family was actually missing. It wasn't until about a week later, October 17th, when the family's truck was found by some hunters. The hunters then contacted authorities about this abandoned vehicle. Inside was the family's dog, Maisie, severely starved and dehydrated. There was also Bobby and Sherilyn's cell phones, maps, a GPS, and $32,000 in cash. Police suspected that the family had simply gotten lost in the nearby woods. Eventually, they were able to find tiny footprints which were believed to have belonged to Madsen. Following it led to a hilltop which is believed to be the exact location where this photo of Madsen was taken, which was in one of the cell phones. There is a lot of debate as to what is happening in the photo. Some say that the child is in distress and about to cry, while others say that the emotions displayed here are neutral. It's also often mentioned that the person taking the photo might not even be Madsen's parents. However, there is some disagreement with this suggestion, as many say that if this was indeed a malicious stranger, potentially even a killer, then it would be much more obvious that Madsen was scared. Authorities later stated that they believed that the trio of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madsen spent no more than 15 minutes in the woods before returning to the truck. But what happened after they got to their vehicle is a toss-up. Over 100 authorities and volunteers, as well as search dogs, were utilized to search the area, but no trace of the family was ever found. There was, however, an 11-page letter written by Sherilyn tucked away in the truck. In it, Sherilyn detailed her distaste towards her husband since she felt that he didn't do enough for his family. She described him as being a hermit and voiced her desire to file for divorce. Then on November 6th, 2013, the remains of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madsen were finally discovered. They were located about 3 miles away from the location of the truck. Now, the bodies weren't confirmed to belong to the Jamisons until a year after their discovery, but the public and investigators were more or less certain that they were a match long before that. Due to the severe decomposition, medical officials had a tough time determining a cause of death. But on the back of Bobby's skull was this tiny hole, which some believe may have been caused by a bullet. Theories immediately started spreading once more, one of which suggested that the entire incident was a murder-suicide. Factoring in Sherilyn's inconsistent mental health, the letter in the truck, and the pistol that she was known to carry around, this may have been possible, but this pistol was never found. Plus, families and friends of Sherilyn did state that while she may have had some disagreements with her husband, she still deeply loved her family. Instead, they proposed the idea that the family was kidnapped, which was also a popular theory. Since there were no signs of a struggle within the truck, it may have been possible that the family was led to the forest while being held by a gun. This idea could be supported by the fact that many personal items were left behind, including the family's dog. This theory goes a bit deeper, and some believe that the family was murdered in an event that was related to illegal substances. The fact that the family was carrying $32,000 in cash also raises a lot of eyebrows. Bobby's own father was suspected of being responsible since Bobby had a protective order filed against him, but since he was at a nursing home during the family's disappearance, he was quickly written off as a possible suspect. Owen Hart, born on May 7, 1965 in Calgary, which is a city in Alberta, Canada, was thrust into the world of wrestling from an early age, having two older brothers who wrestled and a father who taught them. Owen's father's name was Stu. Stu was a local wrestling legend and ran a renowned wrestling school. Owen excelled at wrestling in high school, and he made his professional debut while in college and later trained with his father, joining Stu's Stampede Wrestling in the 1980s. Owen's talent took him to Japan in 1987, where he competed in New Japan Pro Wrestling. His hard work paid off when he became the first non-Japanese wrestler to capture the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship in 1988. After finding success in Stampede Wrestling and Japan, Owen signed with the WWF. Here, Owen adopted a superhero persona, debuting as the masked Blue Blazer. Despite his potential, Owen often found himself in mid-card matches, serving as enhancement talent. Owen would later leave the WWF after losing at WrestleMania 5. After his time on WrestleMania, Owen jumped around various cities and countries under the Blue Blazer character until 1991 and later found himself back with the WWF. Now, the focus of this particular entry does not occur until May of 1999. A pay-per-view event was being held on May 23, 1999 in Kansas City, Missouri called Over the Edge. At the time, Owen had moved away from the Blue Blazer character within the WWF, but for this event, the WWF decided to bring back the Blue Blazer and have Owen perform a stunt where he would come flying in from the rafters of the arena. So, come time for Owen to make his grand entrance, he was all set up in the rafter of the Kemper Arena, simply waiting for his signal to fly in. Owen's harness was equipped with a quick release mechanism. The act was originally planned to have Owen come short of reaching the ring for comedic effect. This would lead to Owen having to manually free himself and make the rest of the way on foot. So the cue finally came and Owen flew in towards the arena. Or at least that's what was expected. Instead, what happened was Owen fell 70 feet before hitting the top rope and landing in the ring. Obviously, the audience had no idea if this was somehow part of the act or if they had just witnessed a terrible accident. Unfortunately, it was the latter. Commentators Jerry Lawler and Jim Ross were equally as confused and attempted to inform the audience as to what they had just seen. Medical officials were rushed to the ring and transported Owen out of the building and to a hospital. But the fall was too much and Owen was pronounced dead as a result of internal bleeding and blunt force trauma. Apparently, Owen's final words before meeting his end were "look out." The event itself did continue, which led to heavy criticism from fans later on. Owen's now widow, Martha Hart, eventually stated that she forgave the WWF for what happened, but she wanted concrete answers as to what went wrong. So after months of investigation, it was stated that the harness and release mechanisms were not properly secured. They were also said to be defective, so even if they were secured properly, there was still risk of an accident. In November of 2000, the Hart family and the WWF settled a lawsuit where the Harts would receive $18 million. Most of said money went on to establish the Owen Hart Foundation. A former Egyptian model named Omaima Nelson is infamously known for taking the life of her husband, William Nelson. This act of violence placed Omaima in the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. This case in particular sticks out for many due to the graphic details that come along with it. Omaima grew up in Egypt before moving to the US in 1986. According to reports, Omaima met William Nelson in 1991 while playing pool in a bar. William, a former pilot, had previously been convicted of smuggling illegal substances in 1984. After serving a 4-year sentence in federal prison, William was released on parole and started a new career path. When the two met, Omaima was about half of William's age, William being 56 years old. After just a few days of talking, the two actually got engaged and were married to each other. Of course, you are not going to learn very much about someone in the matter of a few days. Sometime after getting married to William, Omaima noticed that he was a rather violent man. Small disagreements turned into heated arguments, which then quickly devolved into instances of physical and violence, at least according to Omaima. For example, one time when William asked Omaima for sex but was denied, he ended up tossing her kitten out of the car window, then yelling, "I paid for you. I'm getting what I paid for." Fast forward to Thanksgiving of 1991, Omaima was fed up with her situation and decided that more drastic measures were necessary. According to Omaima, that day, William tried to rape her, but in an act of defense, she grabbed a lamp and smashed it over William's head. This was followed with Omaima reaching for a pair of scissors and taking William's life. Now, for most cases, things would likely end here, but this time around, it gets much more disturbing. After William died, Omaima did a number of things with the body, including mixing some of the remains with Thanksgiving leftovers and boiling his fingerprints off his hands. Afterwards, Omaima called 2 of her ex-boyfriends to help dispose of what else was left. She even asked one of them to help remove his teeth. Sometime later, authorities pulled over Omaima when she was spotted driving William's red Corvette through Costa Mesa. Inside the vehicle, police found trash bags containing William's remains. This led to an investigation of the couple's residence, where investigators stated that the walls and floors were stained with blood. Later interviews with neighbors revealed that there was what sounded like grinding sounds coming from William and Omaima's apartment. This sound went on continuously for at least 48 hours. Now, unfortunately, YouTube is very nitpicky when it comes to describing actual details in gruesome cases like this, but I wanted to be clear that it's even more graphic than what I have already shared. In the end, investigators determined that about a third of William was still missing. Omaima was arrested on December 2nd, 1991 under the suspicion that she was responsible for William's death. During Omaima's trial, she and her attorney argued that William's death was simply a result of self-defense. Omaima was also formally diagnosed with PTSD. Ultimately, she was found guilty of second-degree murder and received a sentence of 25 to life in jail. Over a decade later, in 2006, during her first parole hearing, Omaima stated that she had deep regret for her actions in 1991 and was now a quote-unquote born-again Christian. But after further evaluation, Omaima was denied parole as officials believed that she was mentally ill and volatile. Omaima actually remarried while in jail to a man in his early to mid-70s, right around when she was eligible for parole again. But yet again, she was denied. This time around, Omaima's attorney shared some new details. Apparently, Omaima disposed of William in the way she did because she feared that he would punish her in the afterlife. Additionally, the psychiatrist who diagnosed Omaima as insane stated that Omaima revealed she wore a red hat, red high heels, and red lipstick in what she called a ritual on the night of William's death. This final case is really just a sad event, and it's crazy to think that a child is capable of this. It takes us back to September 18th, 2022. 12-year-old Emma Brown was with her father, Daniel, who was 38 at the time, at home in Poolville, Texas. It was here where Emma shot her dad, believing he had died. Afterwards, Emma ran out of the house onto the driveway, where she then turned the weapon towards herself. Medical officials were contacted, and both Emma and Daniel were transported to the hospital where Daniel would survive. But 2 days after the incident, Emma passed away from her injuries. So just what in the world would cause a 12-year-old to do something so insane? Well, after investigation by authorities, it was determined that Emma had actually formed a murder pact with another 12-year-old girl. At first, it was believed that this other kid was from her school, but this was later said to be false. Apparently, this pact entailed that Emma and the other child would both kill their families before running away together. It seems that at some point after hurting her father, Emma may have had second thoughts and realized how grave of a mistake she had just made. There really is very little information that is public on this case, but I was trying to find out more details about this other kid who Emma made a pact with. There wasn't much, but this was what I could find. The other girl, who remains unnamed, lived in Lufkin, Texas, which to my understanding is about 4 to 5 hours from where Emma lived. Now, it's a bit unclear who was going to do this, but at some point after killing both of their families, either this other girl or Emma was supposed to drive over 200 miles to pick the other up. A lot of people suspected that Emma came across this other person online, which instantly made me think that this wasn't actually a 12-year-old girl. I started thinking that this was some malicious adult trying to manipulate Emma, but it turns out that this other person really was just a kid. This unnamed girl went on to be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, but specific details were not revealed. Investigators questioned this other girl to figure out just why they even wanted to do this in the first place, but it doesn't seem that they got a straight answer. It's also entirely possible that they wanted to do it just to do it. Sometimes kids don't need a motive to act a certain way at that age. One official was quoted saying, "I will say that this case is a time to remind parents that it's very important to know who your children are friends with, whether that's in the classroom, social media apps, Snapchat, TikTok, and then also gaming platforms." Emma's family were also questioned about the other girl, but they said they had no idea who she even was. Back in 2013, a 66-year-old hiker named Geraldine Largay, aka Gerry, visited the Appalachian Trail. This was a trip that she had been preparing for months in advance, so as you would expect, she was extremely excited. Geraldine had been hiking for years and needed a new challenge, that of course being the Appalachian Trail. Amongst her friends and family, she earned herself the nickname Inchworm. Now, in case you don't know, traversing the entire Appalachian Trail in one go can take upwards of 6 months. It's well over 2,000 miles and goes through over a dozen cities. And most people don't even have the physical or mental fortitude to complete the entire trail in one attempt. Most of the people that set out on this challenge don't actually finish. In Geraldine's corner was her loving husband, George. Now, George wanted nothing to do with the actual hike itself, but he understood just how passionate his wife was about hiking and just how badly she wanted to complete this challenge. So instead of actually hiking the trail alongside Geraldine, George would frequently visit her at certain points to bring her fresh supplies and just check in with her. These check-ins were done on an almost daily basis. George was quoted saying, "Hiking the Appalachian Trail and sleeping in tents and wearing the same stuff for days in the rain, not on my bucket list. But she needed to be supported on the hike because she had limits on what she could carry. So I simply had to say, okay, suck it up. What's 6 months in the grand scheme of things?" In addition to George, there was another person who wanted to be involved in the hike. Her name was Jane Lee. Instead of simply checking in on Geraldine like George, Jane was actually going to be by her side during the entire journey. Or at least that was the plan. So fast forward to mid-April, the three visited Harper's Ferry in West Virginia to tackle the Appalachian Trail. Geraldine and Jane set out on their journey with George ready to assist them along the way. The first few days were a breeze for Geraldine and Jane. They were all smiles, and George was simply happy to see that they were enjoying themselves. The duo continued and met a lot of other hikers along the way. When Geraldine told these other hikers that she planned to cross the entire trail, they were shocked. Most would have doubted the abilities of a younger physically fit person when it came to hiking the entire trail. So just imagine what they thought about a 66-year-old attempting it. One day, Jane received an unexpected call with some bad news. An emergency had occurred back home. Her daughter had an accident which resulted in her ankle being fractured. Jane apologized to Geraldine and said that she needed to get back home to take care of her daughter. Geraldine obviously said that's totally fine and urged her to rush back home as soon as possible. By this point, the two had covered about half of the trail already, and Geraldine didn't see the purpose of quitting, so she decided to continue the hike solo. While Jane's absence didn't bother Geraldine, it did concern George. He didn't like that his wife was all alone out there in the wilderness, but Geraldine assured him that she would be fine and there were many other hikers out there that she could ask for help if it was necessary. By the time July rolled around, Geraldine was headed into the more rugged part of the hike, and according to many hikers, if you stray from a certain path by even 5 or so feet, you could get very lost at this point. There's even this warning sign telling you to have at the very least 10 days worth of supplies before you even think of continuing the journey. The hike after this sign would have no openings to restock for about 100 miles. So Geraldine and George agreed to meet at the Route 27 crossing for more supplies before Geraldine continued. On the path to her husband, Geraldine rested at a lodge where she came into contact with several other hikers. They sat down and enjoyed each other's company, and this photo of Geraldine was captured. Little did everyone know that this photo would be the last one taken of her before she went missing. George was waiting for his wife the very next day, July 23rd, at Route 27, but Geraldine never showed up. At first, he didn't think much of this and just waited outside his car a while longer. But then it became clear to George that something bad had happened. He tried to contact Geraldine by phone, but these attempts failed as George expected. So he opted to call authorities, who then organized a search party. Days quickly turned into weeks and weeks into months. The search party grew and involved dogs and search helicopters, but no matter what resources were used, nobody could locate Geraldine. People were beginning to suspect that perhaps Geraldine had actually been murdered, but over 2 years later, the public would finally get their answer as to what had happened to her. It was October 2015 when a forester employed by the US Navy named Kevin Adam made a gruesome discovery while researching an area on the Appalachian Trail. During his exploration, he found what looked to be an abandoned campsite. The tent was flattened and nearby was a backpack. Kevin crept closer to the tent and found a zipped up sleeping bag with some lumps underneath. He unzipped it and saw a human skull. Now, Kevin had heard of Geraldine going missing in 2013, so he instantly asked himself, is this Geraldine? He stated that this campsite was hidden pretty well. It would be almost impossible to find without prior knowledge of its location. And right above it were layers and layers of thick tree branches, which would have made it impossible for helicopters to find as well. An interesting detail are the items that Kevin found, or rather lack thereof. Despite being an experienced hiker, Geraldine didn't carry certain items that one might expect, such as a fire starter, whistle, flare, GPS unit, etc. On the trees nearby, there were even signs that Geraldine had attempted to start a fire by hand. And depending on the source, some said that she didn't even have a compass, but other sources stated that she did have one, however she didn't know how to use it. Regardless, it was all very strange. It looked almost as if Geraldine wasn't really prepared to tackle the 2,000+ mile trail at all. Amongst the items was Geraldine's mossy notebook. Inside was a page titled, "George, please read, XOXO. One entry written on August 18th, 2013 said the following: "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Cary. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now. Please find it in your heart to mail the contents of this bag to one of them." Other pages inside showed that Geraldine was keeping track of what day it was since she had gotten lost. It was also revealed that Geraldine had attempted to text George when she went missing. On July 23rd, 2013, there was a text that failed to send that said, "In some trouble, got off trail to go to the bathroom, now lost. Can you call AMC to see if a trail maintainer can help me? Somewhere north of Woods Road, XOX." Geraldine went on to try and send this text nearly a dozen times that day, all of which failed. On the 24th, Geraldine tried to text George once more, this time at a higher elevation, hoping that there would be a signal. "Lost since yesterday. Off trail 3 or 4 miles. Call police for what to do, please. XOX." It was determined that Geraldine had died from a mixture of starvation and environmental exposure. Her husband George passed away in September of 2019 as a result of pancreatic cancer. This next entry takes us back to the 50s and 70s with the formation of a cult by a man named Jim Jones. In 1955, Jim was residing in the state of Indiana, and that's where he formed a group that later became known as the People's Temple. Ever since he was a child, Jim was sent down a religious road, which influenced him into becoming a Christian minister. Now, Jim was a very charismatic man, which was perfect since he later became obsessed with Pentecostalism. And if you don't know, those are basically those super passionate preacher guys. You have probably seen a video at some point of someone grabbing a disabled person that can't walk, for example, speak in some tongues, and then miraculously the person can walk again. That's what Jim Jones did. In fact, there was one occasion during a gathering where Jim demonstrated this ability. It quite literally unfolded the exact same way I described. He gave a disabled woman the ability to walk again. However, this woman, unbeknownst to everyone else, was actually hired just for this act. But many people who attended the event and witnessed what Jim did were sort of convinced that he had some special God-given power. And again, it didn't help that this guy was very, very charismatic. There were many women who also supported Jim that would later go on to say that he was very handsome, and that sort of played a role in them being influenced by him. So all of this in combination created a great opportunity for Jim Jones to manipulate people. Sometime in the 60s, Jim transported the People's Temple over to San Francisco, California. And it's in the 60s where rumors that Jim is rather aggressive and had the tendency to lash out at his followers started coming out. But Jim's followers didn't see anything wrong with this. They literally idolized the man. He could do no wrong in their eyes. Many even handed all of their assets and cash over to Jim and his organization. So as the years went by and the People's Temple became more well known, onlookers wanted to find out a bit more. And it was clear to many from the outside looking in that Jim was not only abusing his power, but he was also abusing and manipulating his people. Jim started getting an immense amount of backlash from the public, and it became clear to him that he needed to leave the area. There were serious allegations that Jim was conducting criminal activities within his group. So as this topic got more and more popular amongst media outlets, he made the decision to construct a sort of community in Guyana, which is located in South America, and many of his US followers wanted to join him there. He elaborated and stated that this community he was building would be free from the oppression that he and his followers were facing in the US. At this point, authorities were on the brink of doing a large-scale investigation into the practices of the People's Temple and finding out just what exactly Jim Jones was doing. It took about a year of discussion between the government of Guyana and Jim before they agreed to let him create a settlement in their country. In the mid-1970s, Jim was able to leave the US for a northwestern part of Guyana and lease this piece of land that was nearly 4,000 acres. And this location was pretty bad for living, as you would expect. It was in a jungle and the overall conditions just didn't seem livable. But Jim Jones guaranteed that he was going to create a utopia for his followers. And those who didn't have faith in him were doubting God. Or him. He literally started to refer to himself as a godly figure. But instead of creating a community for his people to thrive in, the over 900 residents of Jim's settlement, which would later become known as Jonestown, would die. And before we continue, I'd like to shift gears and examine a family of 5, the Parks. It consisted of Gerald Parks, his wife Patricia, and their 3 children. In the 60s, they moved to California in order to stick by the side of Jim Jones. And as we have already discussed, Jim later moved the People's Temple over to Guyana in the 70s. Gerald and his family were amongst those that moved to Guyana with Jim. And we'll get back to this family in a bit since they are pretty important when it comes to this story. In 1978, a man named Leo Ryan, who was a politician, caught wind of those allegations that the People's Temple was facing. He did some more research and realized that the leader, Jim Jones, was actually moving the group to South America. Obviously, this sort of confused Leo, and he wanted to investigate because on the surface, it seemed like Jim was really abusing his followers and relocating was simply his strategy to not be investigated or caught. Leo soon learned that there were claims that those who followed Jim to Guyana were suffering from things such as group beatings, forced labor, and much more. It was also rumored that Jim sort of had an admiration towards some famous dictators in history, which, needless to say, is worrisome. In the fall of 1978, Leo Ryan finally made the trip down to Guyana to visit Jonestown, and by his side was a camera crew and several journalists to document the entire journey. Leo requested that some other officials join him on his investigation, however, everyone he asked declined. So on November 14th, Leo touched down in the capital of Guyana, which is Georgetown, 150 miles from Jonestown. And at first, Jim did not allow for Leo and his group to step foot in Jonestown. It took several days of discussion and compromising before Leo was finally allowed in. And immediately upon crossing into Jonestown, he saw dozens of people greeting him and they all seemed happy. And while the actual facilities didn't quite look like a quote-unquote utopia, it was thriving and again, people genuinely seemed very happy. Jim provided Leo and the group with a tour of the settlement, and things looked to be in a properly organized array. There were hundreds of people there, and Leo took his time interviewing as many of them as possible. Every single person had nothing but good things to say about Jim and their living conditions. Leo literally said that from what he can see and hear, it seemed like Jonestown was the best thing to ever happen for some of these people. But right as Leo was about to convince himself that Jim was innocent, he got a tap on the shoulder. One of the journalists that joined Leo on this trip handed him a note. This journalist said that one of the residents gave it to him. When Leo unfolded it and read it, it said, "Please help us get out of Jonestown." One of Jim's more loyal followers noticed that Leo seemed rather angsty all of a sudden and noticed the note. He immediately rushed to tell Jim that Leo had figured them out. All of the laughter and the smiles was just a facade. In reality, the people were suffering, and those that wanted to leave were not allowed to. In fact, during the 7 to 8 months in which the Parks lived in Jonestown, Gerald made it very clear that he did not like the place. One resident that Gerald confided in had snitched on him to Jim, and this resulted in several members ganging up on Gerald one night. But he stayed resilient and held on to hope that he and his family would survive. Both he and his daughters have shared a lot of detailed information about their stay in Jonestown, and it's quite literally a nightmare. Gerald's two daughters, Brenda and Tracy, shared that they basically worked all day and the food they were given was primarily made up of rice. There was no nutritional value at all. The people were given the bare minimum. So on November 18th, the day after Leo received the note, Gerald's mother had actually walked up to Leo and whispered to him that they hated it there and they needed his help to escape. And Leo told her not to worry and that he would make sure to take with him those who wanted to leave. That was his entire goal with this trip in the first place. Leo was also told that upon their arrival, the residents of Jonestown had all of their personal belongings, including their passports, taken from them. So by around 3 p.m. that day, Leo had gathered a decently sized group of people who wanted to leave Jonestown. Amongst those were the Parks. As you would expect, Jim was heated, but he didn't allow it to show on the surface. He simply waved them off and said, "Okay, you can leave." Leo eagerly got all the defectors onto a truck and drove off to an airstrip where 2 aircrafts awaited them. And those who remained loyal to Jim Jones just berated those defectors and called them a bunch of terrible names. They said things like, "You're turning your back on God and you're leaving this amazing place." It took nearly 2 hours to traverse through the jungle and arrive at the airstrip. But when they arrived, those planes that should have been waiting were missing. Another 20 or so minutes had passed before they finally arrived and could start boarding people. For whatever reason, the Parks family was split up between the 2 planes. Gerald, his mother, and Patricia went on one plane, while the 3 children had to board the other. And right as they were getting on the plane, Gerald Parks heard this humming sound getting closer and closer. It sort of sounded like a truck engine. Then Gerald saw it. A truck carrying Jim Jones's followers came into view from the trees. At first, Gerald simply thought that these were more people who decided that they don't want to stay in Guyana. But then he realized these men were holding guns. As soon as they were close enough, they opened fire. At that exact same time, people within the group of defectors had also opened fire. Jim Jones had sent several of his followers to join the defectors and pretend that they were leaving as well. Amongst those that died on the airstrip were Patricia Parks, Leo Ryan, and at least 4 other people. Eventually, the People's Temple members did leave the strip. Gerald's mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan because he thought that those men were going to return and either finish the job or drag them back to Jonestown. So he got his daughters, Tracy and Brenda, as well as the other children, and told them to run off into the jungle to stay hidden. But Gerald told them to not stray too far as it's easy to get lost in there. He simply wanted the kids to roam around the edge in cover and wait for him to call them back once he was sure it was safe. Tracy was later quoted saying that she was so scared and filled with adrenaline that it felt like she was flying when she ran off the strip and into the jungle. jungle. And once she got there, all she could do was cry as she had just witnessed the death of her own mother. After a couple of hours had passed, Gerald went over to the jungle and called out for Tracy and Brenda, but no one showed up or responded to him. Gerald started to get anxious and ventured deeper into the wilderness, calling out for his kids, but still no sign of them. Turned out that Tracy and Brenda had just continued running deeper and deeper into the jungle because of all the adrenaline running through them. For all Gerald knew, Jim's goons had captured the kids. However, this was not the case, and while they were not captured, Tracy's health was declining. She had recently caught a fever, which really worried her older sister, Brenda. Brenda happened to be the oldest of the group of kids, so she took it upon herself to sort of be a leader for them. She knew that they were still in danger, so she suggested that they continue to seek a better place to hide. By the third day in the jungle, everyone's morale was defeated. Tracy told her sister that she didn't want to go on any longer. She was just too exhausted physically, mentally, and emotionally. Her mind sort of felt at ease at the thought of simply giving up. And being that Brenda was also exhausted, she too started to think maybe all of this effort really was futile. But then she heard what sounded like music getting closer. Brenda jolted back to life and went to hide. She saw several men armed with guns making their way through the trees. At that moment, Brenda came to terms that it was probably over and these men were going to take her back to Jim. Little did she know that these men were actually there to save her and those other kids. After Gerald failed at locating the kids, he and the other adults, as well as his son Dale, were flown back to the US on one of those planes. The pilot contacted a US ambassador and informed him about the incident that had just unfolded on the airstrip. So then the US got into contact with the government of Guyana and they sent out several soldiers in search of the children in the jungle. Additionally, there was another group of soldiers sent to Jonestown. And this is where they made a crazy discovery. Over 900 people were lying down dead. After just a brief sweep of the area, it became clear that this was a mass. What had happened was back when Jim Jones's men returned after attacking the airstrip, they told Jim that some of the people there survived. This led Jim to conclude that the US was going to learn of his crimes and attack Jonestown. Jim called all of his followers and said that the US government was going to come stomping in very soon to massacre them all. Jim then stated that instead they would put their lives in their own hands. Every single member had been given a cup of Kool-Aid that was mixed with cyanide. For those that did not want to use this method, soldiers were standing by ready to assist them. As for Jim Jones himself, he died as a result of a gunshot wound. And something that I haven't mentioned yet is Jim held these gatherings in Jonestown called White Nights. These meetings occurred randomly, sometimes once a week. During them, Jim had his followers consume juice or some sort of fruit drink, a drink such as Kool-Aid. This was done to test just how devout his people were because at any given meeting, it was possible that those drinks contained something lethal. Jim Jones wanted to know that his people were willing to die for him and do whatever he requested. Obviously, nobody was told ahead of time if a certain week's meeting was going to contain the bad drink, but they all knew eventually it was going to happen. In fact, I'm sure that there were people who thought that the Kool-Aid they drank on the 18th was yet again just another test, because each of those White Night meetings, Jim Jones made it seem like it was going to be the real thing. Gerald and his family were some of the very limited few that survived Jonestown, and I'm sure most of the survivors struggled badly when trying to reintegrate into normal society. But Brenda herself has spoken out on several occasions about the terrible PTSD she had developed. She passed away in 2013 due to issues with her health. Gerald Parks passed away from kidney failure in November of 2022. Both Dale and Tracy are the last surviving members of the Parks family who lived in Jonestown. This case takes us to Essex, England, where a woman named Jennifer Cronin had a daughter named Susan. The two were extremely close. Susan really looked up to her mother ever since she was a child and wanted her to be proud and approve of her choices. This included finding a husband. So around the late 80s, early 90s, when Susan was working as a hairdresser, she met a construction worker named Kieren Lynch, who was 3 years older than herself. And Susan really loved Kieren. He seemed seemed like a caring man that was also hardworking. Susan thought that she and Kieren could do an amazing job raising a family, but Susan had to make sure that her parents, specifically her mother Jennifer, also liked Kieren, and she did. Ultimately, Kieren and Susan got married in the mid-90s and had 2 daughters named Matilda and Molly. For a while, the Lynches seemed like an ideal family with 2 loving parents and children who loved them back. Even Jennifer was frequently visiting her granddaughters, who couldn't wait to see her each time. But little did anyone know that what was seen on the outside did not reflect the internal workings of the relationship between Kieren and Susan. You see, Kieren was someone who not only wanted but felt that he needed to excel at everything he did. This led him down a path of working long and physically taxing work hours every single week. In Kieren's mind, he felt that this was the bare minimum in order to provide his family with a proper life. And as you could imagine, Kieren was often mentally and physically exhausted, leading to outbursts of rage at home. At first, this manifested through yelling and smashing objects. When the stress was too much for Kieren to handle, he would resort to alcohol, which didn't do anything for the man except make his situation worse. At times, he would even lash out against his family, the very people that he was working so hard to support. So on the mornings after one of his violent fits, he would apologize to his wife and kids and say that he will do better. But time after time, Kieren just slipped back into these bouts of anger. Susan started asking herself how Kieren went from such a kind man to someone so unstable. She hoped that with time, Kieren would eventually return to his past self, so she didn't tell anyone about his violent outbursts in fear that someone might report him to authorities. The daughters also seemed to understand their mother's sentiment and tried their best to comfort her. When friends and family of Susan's would ask about how her husband was doing, she would tell lies in order to hide the stressful situation that she was in. But these lies only worked temporarily. One day, one of Susan's friends was out and about and saw a man that looked strikingly similar to Kieren, so she tapped a guy on the back and asked, "Is that you, Kieren?" And when the man turned around, she kinda jumped a bit. The man had an extremely lean and haggard appearance, but she could tell that this was indeed Kieren. As a result of his poor mental health and stress, Kieren had lost an immense amount of weight. But along with the stress, there was another factor to blame for his drastic change in appearance. Sometime in 2014 to 2015, Susan was doing the laundry and was in the process of emptying the pockets of Kieren's work uniform. And inside one of these pockets, she found a tube of an illegal white substance amongst other items. Again, Susan was well aware of the hardships Kieren was going through and the stress he was dealing with, but she had no idea that Kieren was using such substances. Susan didn't know what to do next, but eventually confronted Kieren about her discovery. Kieren was furious at first, but begged her not to tell their kids about this. Susan agreed that keeping the kids out of this discussion would probably be the best option, but she wanted Kieren to seek professional help so that they could put an end to all of this drama. Kieren just remained silent with no response. Over the following weeks, Susan started noticing large transactions on her credit card statements and knew that Kieren was the one behind them. She confronted her husband about these purchases, but she was met with animosity, and it was at this point where the relationship really turned for the worst. There was of course violence in the past, but now Kieren was threatening Susan's life as well as his own. Susan was getting to the point where she felt as though she was backed into a corner with no options. She really wanted to tell her mother Jennifer about this and get her advice, but deep down she felt that if she involved her mother, she might be in danger as well. So Susan knew that if drastic measures weren't taken, something bad was eventually going to happen. So she ended up parting ways with Kieren after over 2 decades of marriage. Susan deeply cared for Kieren despite all the hardships the two had been through, and Kieren was reluctant to say goodbye, but later agreed that this was probably the best choice for both of them and their children. For a few years, Susan and her children really enjoyed their new lives. There was never the stress of wondering whether Kieren might come home one night angry, and the former couple occasionally talked to each other, but over time, this became more and more rare. Eventually, Susan had completely moved on from Kieren and met a new man named Mike. And I should mention, Susan and Kieren hadn't gone through an official divorce yet. The two had simply agreed that they would go off and live separate lives. So Susan called Kieren one day to organize a meetup and discuss her intentions to officially divorce. She informed Kieren that she had met a new man and was really happy with him, and their daughters Matilda and Molly also seemed to like him as well. And Kieren seemed to be genuinely happy for Susan and their daughters. He agreed to sign the divorce, and the two spent the day catching up with each other. Susan told Kieren that he was going to find another woman soon to spend his life with. Right as Susan's life seemed to be going perfectly, it did a complete 180. On January 11th, 2018, Susan was bombarded with angry and violent text messages sent by Kieren. In stark contrast to their meeting, Kieren was now threatening Susan's life. He demanded $60,000 in cash in return for his signature on the divorce papers. Kieren added, saying that he left everything else to Susan, so the least she could do is give him this money. But before Susan could de-escalate the situation, Kieren had showed up to her home. He was on the patio with a hammer, smashing everything in sight. Susan immediately ran to find a place to hide and then called police. But when they arrived, Kieren was nowhere to be seen. Susan explained the situation to authorities, stating that Kieren had a bad history with alcohol and other substances, and that they may be the cause for this attack. Right as police were about to leave, Kieren showed up again and tried to get inside of the home, but obviously police stopped that from happening. At first, police were actually about to let Kieren go, but after he started flailing around and shoving the officers, he was arrested. As they handcuffed him and sat him down in their cruiser, he started shouting obscenities towards Susan, who was watching the whole event unfold from her patio. Kieren was facing 3 charges consisting of possessing a dangerous weapon, causing property damage, and displaying life-threatening behavior. A little over 2 weeks later, on the 29th, Kieren was granted bail and told to not go anywhere near Susan, her daughters, or the home. But Kieren didn't listen to this at all. He constantly called Susan's phone as well as their daughters' phones. Susan stated that between the 3, they would receive anywhere from 80 to 100 calls or texts a day. Kieren even showed up to the home a few times as well. Even after informing authorities that Kieren was violating his bail conditions, he was never arrested. Kieren even called emergency services, saying that he was going to end it all, but he was too scared. Authorities rushed to his location to defuse the situation, and they were successful. They suggested that Kieren talk to a professional therapist as soon as possible, and he agreed. Then, the very next day, he was back to his antics of messing with his former family. He did things like sneak into the garage of Susan's residence and turn off the power, and then throw various items around in the front yard. Kieren even started visiting his former mother-in-law Jennifer's home and knocking on her windows before fleeing. Once again, Susan called authorities, stating that not only was her life in danger, but her daughters and her mother's as well. But police more or less disregarded her concerns, saying that Kieren was no real threat and that this was normal for couples going through divorce. Then, unexpectedly, Kieren started hurling charged messages towards his own daughters. After Susan told police about this, they told her to leave home and spend a few days somewhere else. So Susan took Matilda and stayed the night at a friend's house, while Molly was sent off to stay with her grandma, Jennifer. On the first night that Molly was sent to Jennifer's, she received several phone calls, all of which were silent. Nobody responded at all when Jennifer asked if anyone was on the other end. Then around 2 a.m., Molly noticed what looked to be a man in the backyard. Jennifer and Molly hid inside the house and called police, while also spam texting Susan's phone, telling her that Kieren might be there. The police said that they were understaffed, so there would be a delay in sending someone over. But luckily, nothing had happened that night. An officer did a brief search of the property, but found no signs of Kieren. Then, fast forward to March 13th, 2018, this entire case comes to its peak. Susan stopped by her mother's home to pick up Molly. She comforted and reassured her mother that they would be fine in the end. Jennifer lived alone after her husband died several years ago. Jennifer wasn't so much worried for herself, but more so for Susan and her kids. While Jennifer was out in her garden with her dog, Susan and Molly were inside the home preparing some drinks. Then, out of nowhere, Kieren comes out charging towards Jennifer. It was around 10:50 to 11 a.m. when this occurred. As Kieren came face to face with his former mother-in-law, he started dousing her in petrol while calling her all of these terrible names. Susan witnessed all of this happening from a window and called police, who advised her to create as much distance from Kieren as possible. Susan sprinted out of the home with her daughter, but realizing that she couldn't leave her mother behind, Susan went back to try and help her. But right as she came into view of Kieren and her mother, Kieren poured what remained of the fluid on himself and sparked a lighter. Instantly, he and Jennifer caught fire. The fire was reported, and alongside police arrived firefighters. When the fire had subsided, both Kieren and Jennifer were on the brink of death. Susan used these exact words to describe Kieren. He looked like pink charred meat. She also shared in a later interview that she believed Kieren targeted her mother because he knew that it would hurt her more than killing anyone else. He knew how close I was to my mom, and he knew how much we meant to each other, and I think it was the biggest way of hurting me. So Kieren and Jennifer were transported to the hospital. Ultimately, they both succumbed to their wounds and died. Matilda and Molly still had that image of their father being a kind, hard-working man, so it was tough for them to accept the horrible crime he had just committed. When they visited him in the hospital, his entire face was unrecognizable. 72-year-old Jennifer had similar injuries to Kieren all along her body, and at first doctors thought that there was a slight chance that they could save her, but as I just shared, they did end up failing. She was able to fight on for about 2 weeks before ultimately dying on the 30th. Her injuries were just way too severe. Susan stated that her mother had lost all of her hair due to the attack, but despite how gruesome her end was, Susan said that she looked so serene in her last moments. In January of 2019, it was determined that Jennifer was unlawfully killed and Kieren had died by Law enforcement has faced immense scrutiny from the public with this case. Despite knowing about Kieren's unstable mental health and tumultuous relationship with various substances, they never took the necessary steps to ensure that he was of no harm. So this next case is also foreign, but this one takes place in Sweden and it has very scarce details available in English, so I had to translate some Swedish articles and sources to research. I tried to look over a bunch of different translated readings to make sure the details were correct, but there might be a few things that got lost in translation. Lisa Holm is the name of a 17-year-old girl in Sweden who mysteriously disappeared in June of 2015. As more and more details were unraveled about her case, it was soon realized that Lisa was a tragic victim of a terrible and violent act. Lisa was born on February 7th, 1998 and grew up in Skövde. Lisa was like any other teenager who enjoyed spending time with friends and family. She was kind, and her mother described her as an immensely caring and compassionate young woman. Around the time when she graduated from high school, she found a job at a cafe located in Blomberg, which was about 30 to 40 minutes from her home. Lisa had plans to go to university the following school year and pursue a degree in social sciences. At this age, young adults tend to look for more time and opportunities to act as individuals. Lisa was no different. Her father had purchased his moped for her to use to get to and from work. And like any parent, this particular stage is very worrisome for them, so Lisa's dad accompanied her to work for the first few weeks just to make sure that there weren't any issues. So by June 7th, both of Lisa's parents were comfortable with her making the journey to work alone. Lisa reached the cafe without issue and her shift proceeded as expected. Lisa, along with a couple of her co-workers, were responsible for closing up the shop. So after they were done wiping down all the equipment and cleaning up the floors, Lisa sent a text to her dad at about 6:20 p.m. This was the first time that Lisa went out on her own, so she just wanted to let her parents know that everything was fine and she was on her way back now. Her mom and dad were relieved to hear that there were no issues and told Lisa that they looked forward to hearing about her day. Again, the drive from Skövde, Lisa's home, and Blomberg, the location of the cafe, should have taken Lisa no longer than 40 or so minutes to finish. finish. So once the clock struck 7:30, Lisa's dad started to worry. He called Lisa's phone over and over and over, but no one picked up. He didn't even want to think about the possibility that something bad had happened. So he just got on the path to Blomberg, hoping that he would cross paths with Lisa at some point down the road. However, at no point in the actual drive did he see Lisa. So he went ahead and completed the journey all the way to the cafe in Blomberg, and there it was, Lisa's moped. Instantly, the father felt this sense of release course through his body, so he goes inside of the cafe and looks for Lisa, but he just can't seem to find her. He tells the manager that he's looking for his daughter, Lisa Holm, but they tell him that she left. Now it became clear that something was definitely wrong. The manager realizes that Lisa is missing, so while her father searches the area, the manager contacts police. Outside, Lisa's dad realized that the keys were still in the moped. He couldn't think of any good scenario where Lisa would intentionally leave her keys behind, so his mind shifted to the possibility of Lisa being abducted. Both police and Lisa's family searched for her for several days but couldn't find her. What they did find were her phone case, a receipt, a ticket, and a phone screen that had been destroyed. There was also a glove that was located in this barn that was nearby the cafe. But the strange thing about this glove was that the barn it was found in was actually searched the first day that Lisa went missing, but it wasn't found until a day or two later. All of these items were confirmed to belong to Lisa. Then on Wednesday the 10th, more items of Lisa's were found. These included some earrings and her license. The earrings were found in that same barn where her glove was found, and it was on this day that authorities finally released Lisa's name to the public. You see, the days prior, investigators actually kept Lisa's name a secret and only revealed that there was a teenage girl that had gone missing on the 7th of June. After Lisa's identity was made public, a massive search party of over 1,000 people came forward to help search, and one of these volunteers decided to give that barn another search, and he found human excrement. Authorities, for whatever reason, believe that this was from whoever abducted Lisa. With this new and improved larger search party, a lot more ground could be covered. One group of volunteers decided to take a look at a nearby farm, but right as they were pulling up to it, two people came out to them and said, "Hey, we already searched the spot and there's nothing." So the group trusted them and left. But later on, a couple of people from that group said that the two people that confronted them were really suspicious. So they told police about them and they searched the area anyway. Hidden among some branches, they found Lisa's jacket and helmet, and nearby was this sort of rundown shed/trailer that looked almost abandoned. Authorities set their sights there to search next, and immediately after opening the door, this foul odor just burst through that opening. There was one part of the trailer that seemed to grab everyone's attention. In one corner were these lockers, and they were all closed except for one. The one locker left open seemed to be filled with clothing and other items. Investigators got closer and started pulling back some of the clothes, and then they saw her, Lisa. Lisa's lifeless body had been hidden away behind all of the various items in that locker. Part of her clothing had been removed, and there was also a rope around her neck. Additionally, someone had placed tape across her mouth. Investigators were able to find foreign DNA on Lisa, as well as on the items they recovered that day. Now, this particular area, specifically the land where the barn and this shed/trailer were, is called the Martorp Estate, and there is also a home on the property which housed two brothers and one of their wives. The brothers were Lithuanian citizens, and to my understanding, they were simply working on the farm. Authorities ended up arresting the trio, and after some investigation into them, one of the brothers matched the DNA found on Lisa. This brother's name was Nerijus Belevichus. He was born on March 3rd, 1980, putting him in his mid-30s at the time of the crime. So I'd like to go back and discuss the barn. Again, some information may have been skewed with translation, and I believe this is the case with the barn. But if you recall, I stated that there were various items found within the barn, but it took several visits on different days to thoroughly investigate this barn. And from the pictures and video I saw of it, I just didn't understand why that was the case. It didn't seem like it was massive from the outside, and from the pictures that I saw of the inside, it wasn't exactly like there were hidden rooms or anything. But anyways, what I wanted to talk about was that after authorities had arrested Nirupama, they went back to the barn and stated that there was a room inside that overlooked the cafe where Lisa worked. And again, this wasn't some hidden room, it was just there in plain sight. In this room, there was this window that could watch people coming in and out of the cafe. On both that window and the wall right underneath it, investigators found Nirupama's bodily fluids all dried up, some of which had been discolored and had been there for a very long time. And it was either a news outlet or people in the public that later dubbed this the milking room. Lisa's co-workers told police that they actually saw Nirupama and his brother looking at them through that window almost every day. But of course, they had no idea what they were doing, so they thought nothing of it. In that room, there was also a piece of rope tied to this pipe coming out of the wall that also had traces of Lisa's DNA. When medical officials inspected Lisa's body, they didn't find any signs of rape. If you recall, there was Nirupama's DNA found on Lisa, but that's it, only on her. So investigators tried to piece together what exactly happened, because Nirupama was really hard to deal with. Despite the staggering amount of evidence against him, he denied being the culprit. The following scenario is what police believed happened. When Lisa was leaving for work, Nirupama attacked Lisa before she could ride off. He moved her to the barn and then to that disgusting room where he had Lisa suspended by that pipe. Investigators do believe that Nirupama had the intention of Lisa, but he got too quote-unquote excited, hence the DNA on her body. And it was in that moment that Lisa lost her life after running out of oxygen. From there, Nirupama had no interest in the girl anymore, so he moved her to that locker in that little rundown shed. Initially, Nirupama, his brother, and his wife all gave alibis, but eventually his brother did give in and reveal the details of the crime. According to him, Nirupama had come home on the night when Lisa disappeared and went straight to the washing machine. He tossed his pants, shirt, socks, everything inside. Nirupama then told his brother that a girl had just gone missing and that since they were both Lithuanian and really close to where she worked, they would be suspected of being the ones responsible. So the two needed to come up with alibis that would fool the police. Nirupama didn't actually tell his brother that he killed Lisa. Nirupama went on trial in November of 2015 and was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. During his trial, it was revealed that Nirupama had a lot of dark and sadistic on his computer, which may have played a role in leading to his decision to attack Lisa. Prosecutors stated that Nirupama suspending Lisa in the barn may have been something he had seen in one of his videos. In a somewhat shocking turn of events, Nirupama's lawyers actually tried to shift the blame to his brother, saying that he had framed Nirupama for the crime, but this obviously fell apart. The rest of Nirupama's family seemed to be innocent. And one more detail before we move on to some closing statements is that during the time when Lisa first went missing, there was this YouTube video posted to a channel called Lisa Holm. It was titled 13 and the video showed a countdown, but the video ended before the timer could actually run all the way out. It was believed that the owner of this channel was Lisa's abductor at the time, and once that timer ran out completely, some big reveal with Lisa's whereabouts was going to be revealed. But it turned out that this entire YouTube channel was a sick prank, and I believe the original video and channel are gone, but there is a re-upload. So in 2016, Nirupama was locked up in a prison located within Sweden, but in 2017 he was transferred to Lithuania, and he actually won an appeal apparently when he was transferred, which changed the sentence to 15 years. But then this was later retracted and he was yet again given a life sentence, so thank God. But not like this would really matter, because in 2022, Nirupama was actually killed by another inmate. Officials did attempt to transport him to a hospital, but he was DOA. Apparently, Nirupama faced constant harassment from other inmates while he was still imprisoned in Sweden, and this justified bullying, I guess you could call it, continued even after his transfer. It's rumored that at one point, someone dumped hot water that was borderline boiling on top of him. At the young age of 18, Jolee Callan had her entire post-high school life ahead of her. With a new boyfriend by her side and college awaiting her, she made the decision to embark on a final hiking excursion with her ex-boyfriend, Lauren Daniel Bunner. It's believed that the hike was intended as an opportunity for the pair to reconcile and discuss the fate of their relationship, aiming to still be friends. However, unbeknownst to Jolee, this hike would have dire consequences for her. Jolee Callan was born on December 29, 1996, and she had a typical American childhood. She stood at 4 foot 10 inches, and throughout her high school years, she was recognized as rather popular. She liked to display her emotions with vibrant hair colors, often opting for punky shades of pink and purple. She was the kind of kid that mostly everybody was able to get along with quite well and seemed to be someone that had a good personality. In other words, she was a girl that was well liked by mostly everyone and no one could envision her having any enemies. But at some point when Jolee was still in high school, she crossed paths with 20-year-old Lauren Bunner. As described by acquaintances, Lauren exhibited possessive behavior, insisting that Jolee spend time exclusively with him and his circle of friends. And as you would expect of anyone with this trait, Lauren was prone to bursting out in jealous fits. Despite Jolee's prior efforts to end the relationship, she was unable to break free as Lauren would resort to threatening whenever she attempted to leave. Eventually, Jolee managed to sever ties with him, but tragically, this choice would lead to terrible consequences. Several months after breaking up with Lauren, Jolee found a new romantic interest. And around that same time is when Lauren called Jolee asking to go hiking as friends. Despite having reservations, Jolee agreed, even jokingly sending this text to a friend the night before the two would meet. "If something goes awry, you'll know who I was with." On August 30th, 2015, Jolee brought along her dog named Kiba to meet up with Lauren. The two were at the Panati Trail within the confines of the Chia State Park in rural Alabama. And throughout the hike, Lauren Bunner ominously documented the day's proceedings on his Instagram profile. He shared 3 images capturing moments from their final hike together, culminating in a disturbing image of Jolee standing on a cliff edge with her back turned to the camera. Just moments after capturing this picture, Lauren discharged 2 rounds from a .22 caliber firearm, the first of which met the back of Jolee's head. As she fell, Lauren swiftly turned her over and delivered another shot. He then callously pushed her lifeless body off the cliff, which stood at a height of about 40 feet. Lauren then returned to his car where he called 911 to admit to his crime. "I want to turn myself in for the murder of my ex-girlfriend, Jolee Callan, that happened just a little while ago on Cheaha Mountain." Lauren was seemingly indifferent about the crime he had just committed, delivering this entire message in a calm voice, which makes this entire event all the more unsettling. He then waited on the side of the mountain for the police to arrive, probably already knowing that there was no possible way that he was gonna get away with this horrific murder. Police quickly discovered Jolee Callan's lifeless body, with Lauren found drenched in her blood. He was promptly apprehended and charged with her murder, to which he pleaded guilty. During the trial in November 2015, Lauren asserted a shocking claim. He and Jolee had made a pact for murder. He stated that he couldn't fulfill his end of the pact after killing her. And obviously, Jolee's friends and family heavily contested this narrative. They emphasized that she was looking forward to the future and showed no signs of depression. They argued that it was more plausible that Lauren, motivated by rejection, ruthlessly ended Jolee's life when she refused to rekindle their relationship. Lauren's legal team later contended that he was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, advocating for him to be granted youthful offender status. In accordance with Alabama law, individuals under the age of 21 are eligible to petition for this status, ensuring a maximum prison term of 3 years for their offense, no matter its gravity. And Lauren was indeed granted this status. Michael Callan, Jolee's father, reached out to a local ABC affiliate to advocate against Lauren's youthful offender status. The ensuing media uproar quickly returned Lauren to the courtroom, and by December of the same year, his youthful offender designation was revoked. On July 13th, 2017, Lauren admitted guilt to the murder of Jolee Callan, despite his attorneys pleading for leniency based on evidence of his mental illness. But the judge saw through all of this and knew that Lauren was genuinely a terrible person, and thus sentenced him as an adult to 52 years behind bars. But he might be eligible for parole in a little over a decade from now. For Michael Callan, he was satisfied with this outcome and believed that justice was served for his daughter that day. It's the right thing to do. I mean, come on. You don't get youthful offender and maybe 3 years for cold-blooded killing somebody. You don't get that, he said. Jolee was a sweet girl. She was sweet, good girl, and I think she's smiling today, okay? Despite the fact that this crime happened nearly a full decade ago at this point, Lauren's actions still haunt those who hear his story. This is clearly a man who was filled with intense hatred and jealousy, and instead of figuring out a way to talk to his girlfriend about his insecurities, decided to do something that would not only cost the life of his girlfriend, but would end up resulting in him being locked up behind bars. Had Lauren simply figured out a way to talk things over with Jolee, then it's safe to assume that this young woman would still be alive today and could have been living a peaceful and happy life. But instead, her life was cut tragically short and her friends and family are left scarred. The story just goes to show you that sometimes our world is filled with people who you cannot trust for any reason. This case takes us to the state of New Mexico and focuses on a man named David Parker Ray. David Ray was born on November 6, 1939 in the same state in a city called Belen. He grew up with a younger sister, born in 1942. After being married for 16 years, David's parents divorced, and his father Cecil was a pretty harsh and despicable man who wasn't exactly the greatest father figure in the world. He was often angry and violent, and he did things like give David these dark magazines at a young age, which often contained masochistic content, and these magazines may have very well played a role in shaping young David's mind. Cecil ended up taking custody of the kids after the divorce, but not because he actually wanted to raise them, but because he just didn't want his wife Nettie to have them. Almost immediately, Cecil handed the kids over to his parents, who lived in Elephant Butte, which was a tiny little town with a population of about 1 to 2,000. David's childhood was pretty rough even outside of his family. He didn't have many friends, and he was also often found at the receiving end of bullying. One particular characteristic he was picked on for was his awkwardness around girls, and as you would expect, David had many insecurities, which led him down a path of substance use and alcohol consumption. He grew to resent his classmates, specifically the girls. In his free time, David took some paper and pens and created these depraved depictions of young women being subjected to brutal torture. His sister actually found his stash of drawings one day, which understandably freaked her out. And for David's case in particular, it might be easier to explain if we actually jump towards the end of his crime spree. In March of 1999, a 22-year-old woman named Cynthia Virgil was roaming a parking lot in Albuquerque. A vehicle pulled up right in front of her, and the man claimed to be an undercover police officer. Cynthia asked the man how she could help, and the officer said that she was under arrest for solicitation. Cynthia was handcuffed and shoved into the back of the man's car. This man was no police officer, and as you were likely suspecting, it was David himself. David drove Cynthia to this soundproof trailer and chained her to a chair inside. This trailer, which looked completely normal from the outside, was made to torture David's victims and was dubbed the Toy Box. David also had an accomplice at the time that would frequently assist him, this being his girlfriend named Cindy Hendy. There was a wide array of items inside of that trailer that David would use, from medical instruments, devices, and just a bunch of different items that can cause pain, including some that even emitted electricity. But before actually doing anything, David always played this ominous recording for his victims that outlined the things that were about to be done to them. Cynthia was brutally tortured for the length of 3 days. On that 4th day, David and Cindy made a mistake that would finally shed a light on the heinous acts being carried out in that trailer. David had driven off, trusting Cindy to properly lock up the trailer. Before exiting the trailer, Cindy placed the keys to Cynthia's restraints just barely in reach of her. Cynthia struggled really hard, but was eventually able to get her hands on those keys and free herself. But before Cynthia could leave the actual trailer, Cindy re-entered. She blocked Cynthia and tried to wrestle her to the ground. Cindy reached for whatever she could grab and smashed an object against Cynthia's head, while Cynthia was able to grab this tiny little ice pick and use it on Cindy's neck. This created an opening for Cynthia to bolt out of the so-called toy box. She ran for her life in the nude, looking for help, and was eventually able to come across a mobile home. The resident let Cynthia in, and after she informed them about what had happened to her, they immediately called police. Cynthia informed authorities about all of the suffering that she had gone through. They made their way to the trailer, which was parked right outside David's property, also located in Elephant Butte. And after arresting David and Cindy, then raiding the location, we learned that Cynthia was not the couple's first victim. Inside of the trailer, authorities discovered all of David's tools, including a homemade electrical generator, chains, whips, clamps, blades, and much more. Investigators estimated that all of this equipment and various devices that were fastened to the trailer cost David anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000. There were also other handmade items, including this pillory, which is that medieval thing that locks down your hands and your head. David also frequently recorded these sort of memos on a tape recorder when harming his victims. And it's in these recordings where we find out a lot of hidden details. One of these recordings suggests that David may have raped his first victim in his early teens. In it, David said, "I've been ever since I was old enough to and tie girls' hands." It was also revealed that David committed murder for the first time in the late 50s. Allegedly, David tied her to a tree before subjecting her to torture and ultimately taking her life. If true, David was actively committing these crimes for about 4 decades before being caught. Again, at the time of his arrest, David's girlfriend was an accomplice and her name was Cindy Hendy, who was in her late 30s. Similar to David, Cindy was also a criminal. When she was in Washington State, she was convicted of several different charges which involved illegal substances and stealing vehicles. When David met Cindy, they instantly hit it off as they both had degenerate and brutal fantasies involving abuse. But Cindy was not David's first ever accomplice. You see, David had actually gone through 4 divorces prior to meeting Cindy. He even had 2 children, one of which was named Glenda Ray, who was often referred to as Jessie. She assisted David in carrying out many of his crimes. According to Glenda, David even abducted and sold several people to clients from Mexico. This claim was made back in the mid to late 80s, so way before David was ever arrested. But without being able to provide any concrete proof and solid details to police, authorities didn't really look into Glenda's claim. Not long after David and Cindy's arrest, another one of the couple's victims who survived came forward and shared her story. This woman's name is Angelica Montano, and she stated that Cindy had invited her over to pick up some baking supplies, but when she arrived, she was subdued by the couple. After enduring several days of assault, she was able to talk David into allowing her to leave with her life. Angelica was dropped off along a highway where a police officer discovered her. She explained her story to him, but he straight up didn't believe her. Angelica tried calling the police again after a few days when she was calmed down, but from what I could find, it seems that nobody really cared, and thus her case was never followed up on. And there are going to be more irritating and head-scratching details about this case in terms of the legal side and law enforcement later on. It was originally Angelica and Cynthia who testified against David and Cindy. It was also discovered that David and Cindy had murdered several of the victims that they had abducted. Another one of David's accomplices, other than Cindy and his daughter, was a friend named Dennis Yancey. According to Dennis, he was involved in the abduction, abuse, and murder of a woman named Mary Parker. After several days, David and his daughter got bored with Mary and ordered Dennis to take her life. So in 1997, Dennis strangled Mary to death. After investigating the tapes that David had stashed away, investigators were able to identify another female victim, her name being Kelly Garrett, and her tape was created in 1996. Kelly was also fortunate enough to survive her encounter with David. Police were eventually able to find Kelly living in Colorado. She was identified by this tattoo that she had on her ankle. In late July of 1996, Kelly was out for drinks with her husband at a bar. The couple were having fun at first, but their conversation later devolved into a heated argument, resulting in Kelly leaving the bar. Now, Kelly was actually friends with David's daughter Glenda, and after Kelly had left her husband, she spent the night at a saloon with Glenda. It was during this meeting where Glenda slipped a date substance into Kelly's beer. It's unclear to me if Kelly realized that something was in her drink or if she made the decision that she wanted to go back home. But regardless of which it was, Kelly made her way out to the parking lot where Glenda was able to knock her unconscious and transport her to her father, David. One detail that Kelly remembers to this day is the dog collar and leash that David fastened to her. After toying with Kelly for 2 days, David took her life and disposed of her on the side of a road. Or at least that's what David thought. Somehow, Kelly was able to survive a neck wound and get back to her husband. She called police, but just like with Angela's case, law enforcement didn't believe Kelly's story. And when she confided in her husband for help, he accused her of cheating on those 2 days when she disappeared. It should be stated that Kelly's memory was a bit hazy as a result of all the substances she was given. This may have led to her giving police lackluster details, but nevertheless, it's pretty crazy to think that 2 victims reported similar accounts, yet authorities had no interest. Investigators were able to find hundreds of items including jewelry, underwear, and more in David's possession, all of which is believed to have belonged to his victims. After digging through David's other journals, authorities also found records of other victims. However, they couldn't tie them to actual identities. But if left to speculation, it's possible that David has killed or assaulted 100 or more people over the decades when he was active. The subsequent trial was met with a lot of distaste from the public, as the judge decided to try David for Cynthia, Angelica, and Kelly's cases separately. This meant that each account couldn't be used to support the other, which would be beneficial for obvious reasons. The judge also said that a lot of the evidence found on David's property couldn't be used for 2 of the 3 cases. This included David's recordings and writings describing the things he did to his many victims. And in court, Kelly's account of events was deemed to be made up by a number of the jurors. This actually caused the case to end up as a mistrial, while David's legal team argued that the trailer was simply meant for roleplay and all of the nasty things that had occurred in there was consensual. The trial proceeded over the course of a week, and that's when David took a plea bargain which sentenced him to 224 years in prison for charges regarding Cynthia, Kelly, and Angelica. The deal would allow for David's daughter to obtain a lighter sentence, which was 30 months in prison with 5 years on probation. As for that other accomplice I mentioned, Dennis Yancey, he pleaded guilty to Mary Parker's murder. But here's the thing. Dennis stated that it was David and Glenda who orchestrated the plan, but due to a lack of forensic evidence, neither of them were charged for anything related to Mary. It was all pinned on Dennis, who received a 30-year sentence. Then there's David's girlfriend, Cindy, who received 36 years after testifying against her boyfriend. She was released in July of 2019. As for David himself, he died in prison from a heart attack in May of 2002. So aside from the 3 cases we mentioned already and unofficially Mary Parker's as well, it is unknown how many people had met an unfortunate end by the hands of David Ray. And before we actually end off, I'd like to retouch on Glenda's sentence. A lot of people are extremely frustrated with it because it's just 2.5 years in prison, and it's commonly believed that she is just as bad as David himself. It seems that after she was released, she went completely off the grid. The Gladbeck hostage crisis was an incident that took place in Germany in mid-August of 1988, specifically on the 16th to 18th. The young woman you are currently seeing on screen was named Silke Bischoff, and she was 18 years old at the time. Silke had unfortunately been taken hostage by 2 bank robbers who both had a criminal record. Their names were Hans-Jürgen Rossner and Dieter Degowski. The duo eventually forced their way onto a public bus which carried about 30 passengers, and after reaching their destination, they were all allowed to leave except for 2. Several lives would be claimed during this ordeal. The incident began in 1988 on the 16th of August when two armed men with hoods had busted their way into the Deutsche Bank right as they opened up their doors for the public. A bystander had witnessed the odd-looking men and called police around 8 a.m., and just as the two armed robbers exited the building, they noticed a cop car pulling up, which caused them to go back inside and get a couple of hostages. They fired off their weapons several times inside the bank, demanding a getaway car and ransom money. Negotiations spanned several hours, but the criminals were provided with not only an additional 6 figures of ransom money, but also received an Audi 100 around 9:45 a.m. Using the getaway car, the men picked up a woman named Marion, who was Hans's girlfriend. Then on the 17th, the group hijacked a public bus around 7 p.m. Again, there were about 30 people on board. Something you don't exactly see every day is that the criminals actually invited the gathering media crews to hold interviews while they held their hostages in hand. And what's really messed up is that some of these people conducting interviews actually provided photos of the officers ahead just so the robbers wouldn't get tricked if they had some sort of exchange plan drawn up. There were even a number of interviewers who gave beverages to the men in exchange for some words. One interviewer even asked Silke what it felt like to have a firearm pressed against her. During these interviews, Marion snuck off to use the bathroom and police were able to apprehend her. When Hans learned of this, he demanded an exchange. In return for Marion, he would allow a hostage to go free. However, for every 5 minutes that passed without a deal being agreed upon, he would take the life of a hostage. This led to the death of a 15-year-old boy who tried protecting his sister. Now, police actually did intend on returning Marion for one of the hostages, however, they fumbled by breaking their handcuff key, which led to them wasting what little time they had. It took over 20 minutes for medical help to arrive, and the boy would die just hours after being checked into the hospital. Hans and Dieter then made the decision to drive the bus away, which led to the death of a police officer who gave chase. The officer had collided with a truck. The bus finally crossed into the Netherlands around 2:30 a.m., and about 3 hours later, 5 hostages were released, 3 of which were children. Police demanded that the kids were let out or else they would not even entertain any further negotiations. Yet again, the criminals were given a getaway vehicle where they fled the scene with their 2 hostages. But around 2 p.m. on the 18th, a police cruiser rammed into it. This completely immobilized the vehicle, causing a gunfight to break out between the police and Hans and Dieter. One of the 2 hostages still being held was able to escape during the chaos, but Silke was not as lucky. She was struck in the heart by a bullet and ultimately died. As for Hans and Dieter, they were both arrested. This next entry revolves around a young woman named Kaylee Muthart. Kaylee was known as a high-achieving and diligent student that was even in the National Honor Society during her time in high school. However, at the age of 17, Kaylee left school. The reason being was a mixture of issues outside of school which caused her grades to diminish. These included her heart arrhythmia and working extensive hours at work in order to save up for a car. According to Kaylee, she believed that the best choice for her would be to take a break from class in order to salvage her academic record and still obtain a college scholarship. By the time Kaylee was 18, she had started to change. She began to consume alcohol and smoking marijuana. Kaylee shared that her family also had a history of becoming addicted to these types of substances, so she believed that she may be prone to it as well. Another detail that should be mentioned is that Kaylee is a Christian. One particular day when Kaylee was smoking, she stated that she felt abnormally closer to God. She was with a friend at the time and believed that the marijuana she consumed was laced with something harder. And not long after, Kaylee also lost her job. It's unclear if she was fired or had quit voluntarily. Her relationship with her boyfriend had also started falling apart. To deal with the stress, Kaylee ventured off into other substances, including Xanax. She was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder around this time. Kaylee was quoted saying, "It makes sense, since when I felt happy, I felt super happy, and when I felt down, I felt deeply depressed." Fast forward to August of the same year, Kaylee continued to battle depression and recalled that euphoric feeling she experienced back with the tampered joint. So she got the idea of obtaining that feeling again by finding out just what else had been mixed in. This led to Kaylee trying out meth. She was unable to sleep for several days and experienced disturbing hallucinations. For example, when she looked in the mirror, she shared that something looked odd with her face and blackheads started to appear. This caused her to pick at her face to the point where there was blood. After this incident, Kaylee continued to struggle with her mental health, but this time she was debating on whether or not she should try some other harder substances. Ultimately, Kaylee experimented with other stuff while still studying the Bible, which will play a key factor in her future hallucinations. Around November-December, Kaylee's circle of friends primarily consisted of addicts. Kaylee's family tried to help her and even get her to commit to rehab, but that never happened. She was also hopping around house to house, struggling with her substance abuse. Then on the night of February 5th, 2018, Kaylee took a significantly larger dose of and the next morning on the 6th, she stated that she began to hallucinate. After recalling fragments of that morning and comparing them to what onlookers had witnessed, Kaylee said that this is how she believed events unfolded. The friend that Kaylee was staying with at the time was not present on the morning of the 6th, so Kaylee thought that she had gone to church, so she walked along a train track that led to it. Despite being 10:30 a.m. at this point, Kaylee said everything looked dark. And it was in the darkness where she noticed a source of light with what looked like a white bird resting at the top of it. For whatever reason, this prompted Kaylee to think that she needed to offer up a sacrifice to the world. In her mind, this was a request from God. If she didn't sacrifice anything, everyone she knew would die. This sacrifice would end up being Kaylee's eyes, and she was totally convinced that this entire scenario was real. So she collapsed to her knees and cried out, "Why me?" And then Kaylee proceeded to remove her eyes. The actual details that she shared are way too graphic to be shared on YouTube, and she later stated that if no one helped her, she would have gone much further. Apparently, Kaylee wasn't too far from the church at this point, and a pastor actually saw her, so he rushed out and restrained her from causing any more damage. Kaylee was immediately rushed to the hospital, and what was left of her eyes were removed in order to prevent infection and salvage what was left of her optic nerves. She wouldn't wake up for 2 days, but when she did, Kaylee stated that everything was dark and she knew exactly why that was. Kaylee was officially blind. She said that she had plans to attend 90 Narcotics Anonymous meetings over the course of 90 days shortly after being discharged from the hospital. She was quoted saying, "It took losing my sight to get me back on the right path, but from the bottom of my heart, I'm so glad I'm here." Ursula Herrmann was described as a fun and kind little girl who lived in Bavaria, Germany. In her free time, she was often found practicing piano or doing gymnastics. Where Ursula lived, there was a stretch of forest that was frequented by hikers, bikers, and joggers alike. On September 15th, 1981, 10-year-old Ursula went on a bike trip back home from her cousin's place. And it's on this bike ride where Ursula would go missing. School had ended and Ursula had just finished her gymnastics lesson after class with her cousin. After hanging out at her cousin's house for a bit, Ursula headed back home. It was about 7:30 p.m. at this point. It wasn't so dark to where you couldn't see yet, but the night was well underway. Normally, this bike ride home wouldn't take more than 10 minutes. So after about half an hour after Ursula set out, her mother began to worry and called her sister, believing that Ursula hadn't left yet. To her shock, she was told that Ursula left nearly 30 minutes ago. This prompted Ursula's father to rush out in search of her. Even Ursula's uncle helped out in the search, but nobody could find any trace of the now missing girl. Police were contacted, and in no longer than an hour, large search teams consisting of police and firemen were out looking for Ursula. Hours would pass and no clues would be found. Hope was beginning to fade with everyone as rain started to pour, which made the dogs much less effective. However, just before midnight, Ursula's red bike was found, but still no sign of Ursula herself. The search continued the next day, and news of Ursula's disappearance started to spread fast. Radio shows informed the public of the missing girl, who stood at about 4 foot 7 inches tall with blonde hair, last seen wearing a gray woolen cardigan and reddish sandals. 2 days after Ursula disappeared, Ursula's parents received a phone call, but when they picked up, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then, suddenly, a brief tune could be heard. They believed that this was a jingle played by a local radio station. The parents weren't exactly sure how to handle this situation. The calls definitely felt sinister, but it's not like they really revealed any information. What was the caller's intention in the first place? Could it be a hoax, or was it a legitimate call from the kidnapper? Similar calls were made to the Herman household that night, which led to police setting up equipment to record any future calls. Then, the very next day, the case would make a significant progression. A grim letter was delivered to Ursula's father. The letter consisted of words constructed from cutouts from various newspaper clippings. Being that this was in German, this was what the letter roughly translated to. "We kidnapped your daughter. If you ever want to see your daughter alive again, then pay the ransom," which was about 500,000 USD. And what's really interesting is that this letter was actually intended to be delivered a day earlier. It mentioned how the kidnappers would make a call to the family, and the parents needed to just say if they would or wouldn't pay the money. If they chose not to pay the ransom, or if they called police, Ursula would be killed. That same day, another call was made to the Hermans. Ursula's mother said that they would pay the money, but begged for some sort of proof that Ursula was still alive. However, the kidnappers didn't provide such proof. Another letter was delivered to the Hermans on the 21st of September, which provided instructions on how the ransom money would be delivered. The location wasn't revealed, but the culprits wanted Ursula's father to drive their yellow Fiat 600 by himself with the money. Now, the Hermans were a normal family that couldn't possibly pay such an egregious amount of money, so a member of the local community donated a portion of the ransom while the state provided the difference. The money was now in order. The family just needed the final instructions to carry out the exchange, but no new letters were received, nor were there any phone calls. In the meantime, investigators tried their hand once more in the forest to try and obtain some clues that might lead to the kidnapper. Over 100 people were part of this search party, and an additional 10 dogs were added. The search team was ready to invest several weeks worth of time into gathering clues, but it would only take 4 days for a major discovery to be made. On that 4th day of searching, rain was trickling down and the scene was gray. By this time, the vast majority of the forest had already been thoroughly combed through. Then someone yelled out for help. In a tucked away location of the forest, about 800 meters from the main path, an officer had hit something when digging in the dirt. Several other officers helped the man dig deeper, and they found a plank of wood that was wrapped in a blanket. The officers pulled this wooden panel out, which revealed another wooden board. This other one had several bolts fastened to it, which would allow the panel to slide off like a lid. It was approximately 2.5 feet by 2 feet. The lid was forced open, and to the horror of everyone there, they found Ursula inside. It said that several officers began to shed tears as they gazed at the deceased child. Ursula's parents were contacted and informed of the news. Her mother was at a loss for words, while her father continuously questioned if she had been hurt before her death. Medical officials determined that Ursula passed away anywhere between 1 and 5 hours before being left in the forest. The case gets a bit stranger though, as the box was about 4.6 feet deep. There was a seat inside that acted as a makeshift toilet, and there were also bottles of water, soda, candy, and other snacks inside. Furthermore, there was an assortment of about 20 books inside. By all intents and purposes, it seemed like the intent was to keep Ursula alive and entertained while she was buried underground. But if that were the case, how did she end up dying? There's actually a pretty simple answer. Ursula simply ran out of oxygen. Whoever designed the box included a ventilation system, but there was no device to actually allow for air to circulate. Investigators believe that whoever was responsible visited the forest to bring out Ursula. However, they discovered that she had died, which is why the Hermans never received any additional updates. Additionally, after seeing the box, police believed that there were actually 2 people involved in the crime. possibly even more. Investigators came to this conclusion due to the size of Ursula's box, not to mention it weighed over 100 pounds. They also think that it was a local or someone that frequented the area due to the location in the forest in which the box was buried. Over the years, numerous interesting suspects would arise, one of which was a man named Werner Masaryk. Werner was known by locals to be a quick-tempered man who was skilled with his hands. However, his fingerprint did not match the one that was found on the box. Other residents' fingerprints were also obtained, but it didn't belong to anybody. Despite this, police were still confident that Werner was their man. Sometime later, one of Werner's friends was questioned. His name was Klaus Pfaffinger. Klaus was a known alcoholic who was also an unemployed engineer. During his questioning, Klaus revealed that Werner asked him to dig a hole in the forest. Investigators immediately jumped in excitement, believing that they had just closed the case. But this feeling wouldn't last long. When asked to lead them to the location of the hole to see if Klaus was being truthful, he couldn't locate it. During the drive back to the station, Klaus admitted to lying. As for Werner, he was never found guilty of any involvement. Years would go by and nobody would be charged with the crime. However, in the late 2000s, the case would reignite an old spark. Werner Masaryk would find himself at the focal point of Ursula's disappearance once again. So Ursula's case was not considered a murder. Instead, it was regarded as a kidnapping with deadly consequences. And with this particular crime, there was a 30-year statute of limitations. So investigators were sort of rushing to find their culprit. State prosecutors looked back at past evidence and found the names of Werner and Klaus. It was 2007 and Klaus was dead, while Werner was still alive in Germany. After obtaining a new sample of Werner's saliva and testing it against new DNA evidence found on the box, the two were deemed not a match. But authorities still thought that Werner was the kidnapper. So they searched his home and found an old tape recorder. And this is about where a lot of people tend to believe that Werner was wrongly accused. You remember that jingle I mentioned that was placed in the phone calls to Ursula's parents? Well, a sound expert was brought in to compare the recordings on the tape recorder with the jingle heard in the phone calls, and they concluded that this exact device was used in Ursula's abduction. So Werner was arrested in May of 2008. In 2009, his trial commenced and he was quoted saying, "I know I was certainly not a good citizen, sometimes rude, and will see many attempts to portray me as a bad person. But I have nothing to do with this act." And it was true, Werner was not a good guy. Even his children said that he was terrible. On one occasion, Werner even took the family dog and locked it in the basement freezer where it ultimately died. His wife at the time actually divorced him because of this. Moments like this in Werner's life were brought up to further highlight that he was someone capable of kidnapping a child. When questioned as to why he locked up the dog, Werner said that he was punishing it by exiling it to Siberia. Ultimately, Werner was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. And this case does have a lot of finer details which would keep us here for hours. But one final point I want to touch on is Michael Herman, Ursula's brother. He actually does not think Werner was responsible. Michael was present at the trials instead of his parents and thus was able to take in every little detail about the case and every piece of evidence. Another civil case was brought up against Werner by Michael in 2013, which was not actually focused around Ursula. Instead, the case was about Michael's tinnitus, which he claimed was caused by the extensive trials and criminal case of Werner. Michael was actually on Werner's side here. By initiating this case, Werner had an opportunity to prove his innocence, because Werner's defense was going to fight the case on the basis that he was wrongfully accused in the first place. But Werner would lose yet again in the end, and he had to pay a fee to Michael, meaning that the court was still convinced of the verdict from Werner's initial trial. Even then, Michael was adamant that Ursula did not get true justice, but he didn't pursue the matter any further. And there is one final piece of information I'd like to talk about for this case. In March of 2021, there was an anonymous letter made out to several media outlets in Germany. Whoever the sender was, they confessed to Ursula's kidnapping. According to them, they were in high school when they committed the crime, but nobody bothered to dig into the letter any further as the case had legally been closed by this point. This next entry is about a serial killer by the name of Robert Pickton, aka the Pig Farm Killer. He was convicted of taking the lives of 6 women in 2007, but he has admitted to killing 49 people in an interview. When law enforcement first conducted a search at Pickton's pig farm, their objective was to uncover illegal firearms. However, what they stumbled upon was far more disturbing. This prompted them to swiftly secure a second warrant for a more thorough investigation of the property. What they discovered was like something out of a horror movie. Scattered across the premises were human remains, with many of them found within the pigsties. Medical officials later determined that a significant amount of the remains belonged to indigenous women. Robert's father was rarely present during his childhood. Robert also had an older sister named Linda and a younger brother named David, all of whom were raised primarily by their mother, Louise. Louise was remembered as a gritty, hard-working woman who also ingrained that personality into her kids. The children often spent their entire days after school working on the farm, and as you could imagine, the children frequently carried a pungent odor around. This stench made Robert a prime target by other kids in school. Sometimes when bullies would chase him, Robert would actually hide inside the carcasses of animals on the farm, specifically pigs, to avoid being caught. At school, Robert also struggled to talk to girls, and whenever he did work up the courage to, he was always shot down and made fun of. In terms of grades, Robert also didn't see much success, leading him to drop out early on. The treatment he experienced by other children led to Robert retaining mental scars, and it didn't help that his parents weren't exactly the nurturing type. On one occasion, Robert's parents even slaughtered a calf that Robert deeply cared for and raised himself. Another moment that scarred Robert's early life occurred in October of 1967, and interestingly enough, this event didn't actually involve him. So, his brother Dave was out driving his father's truck when he accidentally rammed into a teenage boy named Tim Barrett. Dave panicked and rushed back home to get his mother, Louise. Together, the two returned to the site of the accident, and after inspecting the boy, Louise decided to move the body into this deep swamp area near the road. The very next day, Tim's body was found, and it was determined that he had drowned to death, and that the injuries from the car accident didn't actually kill him. Robert respected his mother greatly, and knowing of her actions sort of enabled Robert to do the same thing later in his life. His first victim was killed in the early 90s in Vancouver, British Columbia on a remote farm run by Robert himself and his brother. The brothers even started a charity organization and held parties and gatherings at their farm to promote it. However, these events were simply disguised as charities. They were actually degenerate parties that often included criminals and workers and frequently went up to several thousand people at a time. Initially, there wasn't much suspicion that something was happening on the farm, but in 1997, one of the workers at one of Robert's parties reported that he had attempted to murder her. The charge was ultimately dismissed, but this occurrence did make a few investigators uneasy. Fast forward to February of 2002, Robert's farm was raided by law enforcement after receiving a report that he had illegal firearms in his possession. Police weren't able to find any illegal weapons, but they did find items belonging to several missing women. This led to a deeper search of the property with the goal of finding human remains, and in the end, they obtained DNA from over 30 different women. Robert received 5 murder charges immediately, which increased to 26 in 2005. According to Robert, he would take his victims to a meat rendering plant and then feed the remains to his pigs. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. His sentence included a 25-year prison term, which was the max sentence for his crimes. Robert was believed to have committed many more murders, but the judge did not allow for those charges to be included as they wouldn't be able to increase his sentence.